Yeah, thanks again for doing this. I appreciate it. But no, what I was saying is a lot of the podcasts I'll watch, I kind of just try to take in anything that they're talking about and see what I can do with it, and I just hop around a lot. I'll just find any random podcast that I can get on, see what other people post. And I generally can take away something from mostly everyone. So I try to have this podcast, relate to that a little bit and see what we can get out of it. And generally speaking, every episode that we do, there's some nugget that I'll pull out of there. And most of the time it's like 5,
Yeah, of course.
And, so that's
because you're the conjurer.
Yeah.
Sure.
This is actually a band that one of my friends made me. He forced me to go to the show to watch this band.
Oh, right.
And the guitarist literally made a space in the middle of the show, forcibly, and basically did this solo. And the guy's hair is kind of down to his butt.
Yeah.
They're a European band too, so they're a little extra weird. Because there's very little boundaries for a lot of European music.
Sure.
I don't know why they're not as judgmental.
They get to experiment a little more.
Yeah. So the guy took the whole middle of the mosh pit and just did this solo mosh part and just kind of was basically just playing by himself, even though the whole band was there, and he just took that area over for 5 minutes, and it was pretty unbelievable. Usually I think that would be kind of a douchey move or whatever, but it was pretty cool. So but yeah, thanks again. And I appreciate all the notes that you kind of sent me before we got together today, because it was very helpful. It brought up a lot of really cool ideas. So you guys actually met at Columbia originally, or
no, we
didn't meet at Flashpoint. You were teaching at Flashpoint.
Oh, I thought you meant
so I teach at Columbia College Chicago in the game design, but then currently, but back then I would also teach at other places. So there was a place called Flashpoint Academy, I believe.
Okay, gotcha.
And so Flashpoint was sort of a vocational school that was really just focused on digital media.
Gotcha.
And so then, back then I was, I was a Pilates trainer actually as my full-time job.
Okay.
And then I was moonlighting as a professor. So one of them was at Columbia College Chicago and the other was at Flashpoint. And so one of the courses I had to teach was a game culture course because, and which appeals to me because of philosophy. So then that's where I met Justin. So he was a student.
I see. Okay. Yeah.
I wasn't actually in your class.
Oh, you're right. You weren't in my class. Right, I forgot. Everything blends together. Go ahead.
I was one of the other students at this vocational school. Ended up being a co-founder of the startup that we started together, and he was in
That's right.
Bill's class, and this guy Josh Hernandez and we were trying to do a game studio thing because we knew that getting a job in the industry was going to be tough, so we were trying to put together our own games, and we spent a few weeks working on a match 3 puzzle game for the Xbox. And Josh was trying to sell Bill on the idea for a little while. I think he was a little reluctant, but
so I was sort of my professorship at that point was based on my work in the video game industry. So so Josh was in my class, and then he wanted me to come over and look at this game, and I was very skeptical because I'm okay, yeah, because normally, you see it and it's usually not very good, and anyway, so I went over to his house, and then I still kind of remember this curtain parted, and then Justin stepped out from behind it, and then I'm okay. Well, it wasn't even so much that, it was just that I looked at the game, and the game looked really good, and it was a really interesting idea, and then I found out his background, MIT, right? Yeah. So I'm oh crap! Now I got to work with these guys because when you sort of find something of high quality, then you're just, so it's. I think maybe that's one of the general themes maybe for today is that it's learning to. And this goes back to your value theory because I was thinking about your value theory before. That often we think that there's subject object, that I'm a separate person, and then from whatever the object is, but what I've learned in my life is that really the world chooses you. So in that case, it was like, you know, as much as my feelings subjectively were that, it's like, oh no, actually the world's choosing me, because here's a situation where I didn't have to think that this is obvious to get involved. Partly because of his pedigree and his brilliance, and Josh too. So Josh was sort of, it was a classic, you know, with business, you need the sales side and then sort of the aesthetic side, and then you need the technical side. So they had both of them together. They had that. And, and I like both of them.
Yeah, that helps.
Yeah. Well, they're very different. I mean, because, you know, Justin's very more cerebral. Josh was much more, Josh's still smart, but not as, you know, inherently cerebral. He was more of a people person.
Yeah.
So, that kind of thing. So,
yeah, I like how certain times in life, you know, there's things that come up, and I don't mean stuck in a bad way, but situations arise, and you realize that it's like your calling, you know, or you can't walk away from it because you shouldn't walk away from it.
Yeah, calling's a good word. Yeah. So at Columbia College, I teach soft skills. So I have this diagram that I learned from various different influences over the years, and so someone exposed me to this idea of what they call the game of life. And so and it goes back to Joseph Campbell, like the game of life is there's a call to action. Okay. And then that's part of it, is like learning to live life, listening to the call for action.
Gotcha.
So then that was so the classic one is Star Wars, the 1976, you know, Star Wars, I guess it was the third episode.
Yeah.
Star Wars A New Hope, I guess. Where he's living a farmer's life. You know, he's been adopted by his aunt and uncle, Luke Skywalker. Yeah. And then, you know, so it's very mundane and things are how they are. And then all of a sudden, his aunt and uncle is murdered, you know, and so it's sort of a more brutal kind of call to action where it's so obvious that he has to. Yeah. And so almost reluctantly he goes on that, you know, so he can go from as simple as just meeting them in a really harmless way or safe way to something more extreme like that. So, and it's learning, it's a big thing, I think, and that's what I was trying to get at, is that learning that it's flat between subject, action, and object, that we think that our subjectivity is independent from everything, but it really isn't. So when you learn to let go of your subjectivity and let other people influence you, then that's sort of ultimately where I arrived. And so that's kind of how I experienced it. I think that's what, to reference what you're doing with your podcast, it's the same kind of thing where you're expanding your view and allowing. So now it's not, so, and it's no longer yours, so to speak, because you're cultivating others. And so, that's kind of the worldview. So anyway, so when we ran into each other, coming back to the topic, is that, so I met them and I was like, okay, surprise, and okay, I got to work with them in whatever way that looks like. So
what was the name of your guys' startup?
Tell them the first.
It started as Metamorphosis, Moore, after my last name.
I've seen the name, or I've heard it from you before.
It's probably like very early, because when did I start working out with you 10 years ago?
I was thinking about that last night, because I was just sort of thinking, when was Justin in school, and when was Justin doing this project with Bill, and I was kind of going back.
It would have been like right after I left TapMe, which is what we rebranded to after we went through a tech incubator, kind of like it was Techstars, a precursor kind of thing.
Yeah, called Accelerate Labs. So that's the whole idea with Accelerator is, if you want to start a company, you go into an accelerator, and then you have like a set program to kind of normalize all of them to the right way to organize the business. And then you meet connections in the city of Chicago.
Get investors.
Well, then the big impact of TapMe was the inspiration or spark for 1871, which is now in Merchandise Mark, which is the big Chicago incubator space. Mm-hmm. And it was the spark for it because some other people observed it. And was like, actually, I think it was Josh's idea with the fail.
I mean,
right?
We had. I don't know how much, but like all maybe a quarter of a floor in the merchandise mart that had been, this is like right after the financial crisis, 2008, 2009. And there was a bank that had like a call center out there that just completely shut down, and they just like ripped everything out. Okay. And so it was just, it was a very vacant industrial sort of space that we were able to actually, I'm forgetting the name of the guy from Flashpoint. Howard Pullman let us use the space. So Howard Pullman was running the academy that we were studying.
Flashpoint was running. Yeah, he owned Flashpoint, started it and owned it, and so they were students. So Justin was also a student at Flashpoint.
I see.
So I was a teacher at adjunct, what they call adjunct. So I wasn't officially part of the company. Yeah. And then Josh was part of it. So Howard was, we asked him for investment for the company, but he didn't. But instead, he just gave us the space,
which is
for free, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. And can't beat that.
No, for sure.
Right. And we invited maybe half a dozen other startups came into the space because we had just more than we knew what to do with.
Well, we should describe the space first. It was just like a concrete floor. It was like a frat house.
Yeah.
And I think we were all guys, wasn't it? I mean, it was pretty...
Yeah, some of the other companies had...
but when we started,
it was like,
So we had this disgusting, dusty, dark... Yeah, no, nothing. And so
it's very movie-esque in a grimy.
But it's perfect for a startup and a bunch of dudes who don't really have much.
Stay focused on
Well, not even just our value system isn't very good when you're young men. But
that's true.
So then I forget who. Well, so then we had this idea.
Actually, Jared Steffes, I think, was a pretty pivotal piece of getting other people.
Well, so so Jared was one of the other co-founders, I guess. So at the time, to be an entrepreneur is the idea of fail fast. So it's good it's very topical. Like SpaceX, the other day they blew up their 8th rocket, 7th and 8th they blew up.
Yeah,
but that's the core mentality for entrepreneurship. Because the reason you want to fail fast is through failing. That's where you find
your info,
the info of what to do. Yeah. So it gets you quicker because you're getting to failure faster.
Yeah.
And so we called it the fail cube. So the idea being like invite companies in to fail as quick as they can, because if they did fail, then we help them.
Yeah.
And then plus it was just free space, and there's so much space that it was so Jared and Josh, and so then that sort of
Kevin Willer is it Willer?
Yeah, Willer was part of then 1871. So J.B. Pritzker, Kevin Willer, there's a few other people who then
they kind of saw the space that we were doing, and then they were like, "Oh, we could really professionalize this and make it like a hospitable environment for startups." And
it's sort of poetic. So I didn't realize it started with and sad, tragic, somewhat. Because it started in 2008 with the bank failure, I guess, because of that.
Yeah.
But now, recently, they just announced 1871 is closing. The physical location is closing because when the pandemic hit, everyone went more remote. So the need for a space like that, and then they couldn't figure out a business model. I think is what they announced in terms of getting it to work. So now it's shutting down essentially because of the pandemic. So it's interesting that there's the 2008 bank and
it's got a cycle of life too.
Cycle. Oh, very nice. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's actually a really cool thing that kind of came together, because I feel like it would be inevitable for you guys to help other people, but then in turn, because people have all these ideas floating around you all day, you're picking up on things, and it's kind of a brainstorming environment.
Well, and I think that's the number one, sometimes the number one skill too. I mean, there's all these different entrepreneurial skills, mindsets, like the failure I mentioned.
Yeah.
But another one is generosity. So like the best entrepreneurs are generous. So thus Howard.
Yeah.
He was generous to give us that. I mean, it serves
some students who.
Yeah, I mean, but it definitely serves his need. It's not like a foolish generosity. Like he's being generous to give us the space for free. But it serves his purposes too, because if his students are successful, it helps his company.
Brand.
Yeah. So, but at the same time, it's still generous. So I mean, it's and also prudent in a lot of different ways. So generosity. So I think so back to the fail cube, at least for us, in terms of us being generous, that's a
Yeah.
good thing. So this might be a good framework for some of this. Is the way I teach now is, traditionally with school, you sort of teach ways of doing, right? So like out in when you're doing lifting, right? You teach how do you do it, how do you do good technique, and like jujitsu, right? You're learning all the right moves and getting command of that. That's ways of doing. But more importantly is the way of being. So the way of being is who are you being while you're doing it. So that idea then of being generous, so your being is generous while you're also doing all the things you need to build a company. So the fact that we were doing that, like I said, it was these, between Josh and Jared, in terms of this idea of the fail cube of being, embodying this way of being where it's generous, and passing it on from power down. Yeah. So that's really I think the trick. And that's a lot of my focus now with education, with students, is teaching ways of being in parallel with ways of doing.
Interesting.
Because it's yeah.
So you kind of got away a little bit. Well, I'm not really sure exactly how you started. So it's
of
an
course.
assumption, but you kind of got away from sort of the traditional way of thinking of like, we have to get through this material and it's just strictly a pass fail. It's more you're trying to entwine it into their, like internal being, like, it sounds like you're trying to build them as a person.
Yeah.
Human and like somewhat of a maturity almost, I feel like that's more of a long-term type of education. And one of the things I thought about when you sent me a lot of great notes. It was like a fantastic email. I told Justin, I was like, man, he sent me so many things that I was like, I have to come back to this because I don't even have time to think about it. It was such a good thing because it was in depth. But I had one professor early on. I had many great professors after that when I transferred schools, but I had one professor early on that somehow picked up on the fact that I really wasn't studying that much. I wasn't paying that much attention to school. I was just there to be there because that was the next step after high school. And it was a writing course because I was a journalism major.
Yeah.
And he was kind of like a hippie. And I definitely wasn't. I'm much more relaxed now, but polar opposite personalities back then.
Yeah, gotcha.
But he approached me one day after class and he said, I really want you to just go home and write. And he goes, maybe, you just get some food out and, you're chomping on some food and you're writing out some stuff, or you maybe just like, have a good time with friends, but I want you to come home and write after that when you're in a good mood. And he goes, I want you to start looking at this as like a much more enjoyable process. And he goes, don't look at it as such a mundane, I have to do this because there's a deadline or because the pressure of, not making it. And for some reason that little speech that he gave me just unlocked all these ways of doing work from there forward. And it wasn't just writing, it was math class. It was, it was a philosophy class. It was just...
You could try to enjoy the study.
Yeah. And then that eventually turned into, being a real adult and figuring out how to do things, but have fun doing it. Like every day you and I train out on the floor. You have a really good time doing it for the most part, even though it's tough.
There's struggles, but
but it sounds like that's in essence what you're kind of trying to pass along in your own way to people.
Well, what was the impact again on that from that professor?
The impact from him was that I really didn't have a true direction yet. And he was like, I see that you can write. I don't see you putting a lot of time into it. I see. It's very haphazard.
And so that moment woke you up a bit?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
So what was it? What did you feel? And
I just felt like I could have
in that moment, I guess.
I just felt like I trusted him because he came to me and was real with me as a person. It wasn't, he was strictly trying to get authority figure laying the law.
Okay, well, we got to it. So I have a word for that. It's called love. I have to unpack this. So love is obviously a loaded term, but so one of the things is I research like best team behavior, and long story short, most companies are controlled by fear. Right. So fear means like, I don't do my job, I'll get fired. I don't do this, I won't get a bonus. I don't do that. So it's school. I don't do this, I won't get a grade. But controlled by love is a different approach. And so I learned this through this Japanese. Gosh, this might get long-winded. So, so there's a Japanese professor, Ikujiro Nonaka, who came up with this term "control by love" as a new way to manage teams.
Mhm.
And I'll tell you what the definition is, and I'll tell you the history of it, because it's the history of why is this Japanese guy proposed control by love is really interesting. So I was like, what does he mean by control by love? I'm like, what is love? And so then I found there's that famous song,
right? Yeah.
there's a what's a 90s song? What is love? Yeah, how do
I jokingly or seriously put on Hadaway in the gym at least once a month.
Well, that's what I'm trying to say is that's in you, because that's what he taught you and I'll explain it. Okay, so so that's the issue. So what is love? So that's the question. So I play that with students, by the way. That's a technique I use just to be like, to wake them up. Yeah. Like to be like, okay, so what is love? Okay, so now I'm going to come.
Now I know why I put that on.
Yeah, no, seriously. I 100% believe it. So what is love is, and this I got from this defrocked Catholic priest. So, well, before I tell you who that is, I was looking for like, what is love? So I went to Hadaway, and obviously, okay.
Yeah.
He posed the question, but didn't really, I don't know if there's an answer in the song, maybe there is. But I couldn't find a good one, right? There's romantic love. We all know romantic love. There's love of family, which, there's some other good ones.
I'm thinking agape. I don't know.
Agape, you finished my head. I was literally trying to think it, and thank you.
Who was it, Justin?
Agape.
He said like a bunch of different kinds of.
So AGAPE, agape, but you pronounce it agape. And then Donna Summer has a song where she talks about agape. So
gotcha.
And then there's also there's another Japanese. So I researched Chinese ones. So in the Chinese, there's Jian I, so Ji apostrophe an and then space ai, Jian I, which is this sort of Chinese philosopher who was buried by Confucius. So in Confucius, love is very familiar.
Yeah.
Jian I is more universal love.
Gotcha.
So was this. So anyway, so I looked at all that, and that was all good. But finally, I found this Catholic priest, Anthony DeMello, but he was defrocked from the Catholic Church because he had more of this definition of love. I mean, sure, there's
a little liberal.
Liberal. So he had more of this Chinese Jianai or the agape thing. So they defrocked him, but he had the best definition of love, and I'll tell you what it is. And that's what, going back to your interaction with your professor, that's what he was controlling you by. So in controlling you by fear, like do it or you're not going to get a good grade, all right? He said, he was being real with you. That's what I picked up on.
Yeah.
So the core definition that Anthony DeMello talks about is being real, and then when you're real, then taking the next action.
Yeah,
that's it. So control by love is being real, and then you take the next action that occurs.
Yeah,
and then that's the whole basis of it. So in that moment, he was controlling you by love because he was being real, and then he proposed an action, right? So so that's the other one. So one of my devices when I teach is I use not only Hadaway, but I also use will.i.am and Britney Spears. So I just try to be as absurd as possible. So I say will.i.am and Britney Spears are our holy prophets.
Yeah.
Because one of their lines from one of their songs is "Bring the action." Like will.i.am, I think, "Bring the action." I forget the name of the song, but I just say "Bring the action" all the time.
Yeah, I see where you're going.
Because bring the action is one half of control by love.
Yeah.
You have to be real, and then that's control by love.
Yeah.
So that's a new way of controlling people. So your college professor knew it.
Yeah.
The stuff I just talk about is just giving more of a theoretical framework for what that wonderful professor did.
Yeah.
And by the way, is he still around?
I believe he's still teaching. I think he was pretty young when I was in college. So I
have a challenge for you. Choose to accept it. Yeah. Well, just reach out and just say, "Hey, I was thinking about you. Yeah. You and I had this interaction. This is what happened. It impacted me.
Yeah.
Thank you."
Yeah.
Because then, going back to ways of being, it's like
generous.
Okay. So
Well, and you know how it is. Sometimes the smallest, little movements will create these huge movements in the long term, and I really think that sprung a whole
clearly
line of things.
Clearly, I mean, I feel it, and the evidence isn't just in what you said now, but it's also evidence in he created this comes from Buddhist stuff. We can get into that if you want. But Buddhism, one of the first things they do is try to crack your ego. Right. So that's also what he did. When you crack the ego, it opens you up. And then when it opens you up, then then you're able to listen. So he was seminal in cracking you open a little bit.
Yeah.
And it's obviously because he came from love, right? So it's sort of one of those things where, like,
for sure,
because he could have been bitter or selfish and just, oh, you're not doing your work. Oh, I just tune you out. But he created a space for you to be.
And it's without a doubt that if I had chose not to take him up on his advice, he would have failed my ass for sure. And, so it's not like I didn't have a consequence. It was just the way he presented it. It really made that consequence seem like it wasn't
the main point.
It wasn't really there, even though it was. It wasn't looming, and it allowed me to just do what I needed to do.
Well, it's interesting. It's such a synchronous thing, because I literally last night, I have a student now that literally last night emailed me yesterday who's in your same position where he's a little disenfranchised. So basically I just responded. I said, let's just talk this week. And then, my goal would just be to listen and hopefully
for sure
to give him that. And there's another phrase that is really, I forget where I get this, but it's basically the idea we all have superpowers, and then that superpower is granting being to others. So by him allowing you to be who you were, and then also challenging you, that's like a superpower. But a lot of the times we lose sight of granting being to others because we get so focused on ourselves, and then we view ourselves as an object.
Sure.
So when you look at things as objects and that you're not actually them, then the freedom comes from looking this neutrality, and this is from the Tibetan Buddhism that I follow. There's a neutrality of subject, object, and action. And when you see that you're not ever separate from you, and then the action is never separate from you, that they're all sort of the same, then that opens you up to everything. Yeah. And then all of a sudden the world's like creating wonderful stories for you. So.
Yeah. And I give huge credit to people like your student that are willing to reach out and say, hey, things aren't going great.
Yeah.
I'm not feeling good. I want to talk to you. I want to figure out how to go about this. And I think, that's probably one of the biggest life lessons that I've learned in the last decade of my life, whether it's business or relationships or family or anything. And I feel like if the person's willing to sort of start to dig into what's going on, they're committed.
The uncomfortable space where it's like things aren't quite right, but
it's great
working through it.
Yeah, and I love that. It's not that I don't want to hear negative feedback. There's a lot of people that work here, and I have a lot of clients that I work for them, and I think that that if that channel's not open, that's where things can go awry, and you very well may find out that things are not going to work out by having that conversation. That's okay too. But I think it's great that your student's willing to be like, hey, let's figure out what's happening, and it takes courage to be able to want to talk to people about those things, and that's why people avoid it.
Yeah. Well, you're humbling me because you're helping me because, even as much as I've worked with this and tried to condition myself not to be egoistic, like you're repositioning him in my mind just helped me, because I'm not really seeing that part what you're saying, like, oh wait, he's being good by being so brave and courageous. So that's helpful, because then for me,
I try to help my guy out.
Your dog is in my class
for this student right now.
And that's really the struggle. So I think that's what the struggle, sometimes they call it, is we all have our struggle. So it's always, I think it's always, you're going through the Trinity, right? That you're always getting caught up in yourself. Then at times you can get their view, but then caught in the action. And so for you to say that's, and actually then that reminds me of the other great philosophy. So I studied a lot of theology too. So I come from like a Catholic background. Yeah. And we can go into that.
So there's a lot.
So I'm excited about.
Oh, you're a Catholic?
Yeah. I went to a Catholic private school. Not on
purpose.
Oh,
right. So I went
on purpose.
Okay. Not on purpose?
Not on purpose.
You got punished?
Well, they were the ones that let me in.
Okay.
But I found out later how hard I had to work. So I was just so excited to get in to university from, community school.
Okay.
And I applied for all these other schools. For some reason, it just didn't work out. and they let me in, and I was like, cool, this is gonna be awesome. Like, it's a little expensive, but at least I'm in a school. And then I realized, I'm like, man, I would have been much better off at a state school. So I don't know how I ended up getting in there, because it was so hard.
What school was it?
I went to St. Ambrose University.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I don't know how I got denied by all these state schools in Illinois, but like, I was like, hey, we'll take it. You can. And then, yeah, but it was a good learning lesson. I was already ready for that school by the time I got there.
Right.
Had I not went to the community school and met that guy, which
okay.
I need to figure out his name, that'd be a good start.
Oh.
But
Well, no, of
yeah.
course.
So, but I'd be really interested in hearing, about the sort of like your Catholicism side.
Yeah. No.
Philosophy from the
Yeah. What was it?
Catholicism.
That was sort of a disruption.
The
from my-
segue.
I have a question for Justin though.
yeah.
Quick. So when you met Bill, and I mean this in a really good way, but was he very similar minded as he is now back then, or have you seen him grow like in his own person, like in the develop? Because you have a very, very cool way of thinking, and I'm just very interested and enamored just hearing you talk. I mean, even just seeing your email.
Yeah.
This is going to be great, right?
Yeah.
But like,
Appreciate that.
is this something that you noticed in him when you met him initially, or is this something that you've seen him just sort of build on to who he is?
I mean, he had it initially, and he's built upon it in the decade
Yeah.
plus that I've known Bill. I am not a teacher, and I know that. But I knew right away that Bill is a teacher, and he, like, I think there's a sort of mentor-teacher sort of duality. You might think they're kind of the same thing, but mentors let students come to them. Teachers seek out students, and Bill is generous with his knowledge in that he is willing to invest in bringing students into the fold.
So you sought him out initially when you wanted to get him involved with the video game,
Yeah.
and is that kind of when you sort of feel like that?
Well, so I kind of Bill talks about kind of when he was checking out the game that we were developing, and then I kind of emerged from this back room, and he sees something in me that compels him to join the group.
Yeah, absolutely.
When I saw Bill, I wasn't quite as insightful. I might not be as intuitive as Bill is, but within like the first month or two of really working with Bill, I could see that Bill has gone through a lot of the stuff that I'm probably going to go through, and we this will probably throw us on a wholly different tangent.
We need a dry erase board.
But
Track all this shit.
Bill has a lot of experience with this thing called the Colby index.
The cognitive. There's three faculties of mind. So we all know cognitive, IQ. That's how you assess it. Emotional. So there are now emotional
EQ,
intelligence tests that you can measure, and everyone knows that. There's this third faculty of mind that most people don't know, which is called conative. So it's CONTAIVE, or conatus is in the Latin. So sometimes it's your way of being, how you do things. The best example is this conversation.
Sure.
So since you invited me, it's centering around me. My conative style is just to jump topic to topic.
Yeah, I love it.
Okay. So you must have you must cognitively have some of that that you can follow me.
Yeah.
Because when I talk to other people who don't, I have to adjust it. To especially students sometimes.
And that's one of the ways that I've grown back significantly.
Awareness.
Yeah. But I could just kind of see that, like, Bill was a lot more like me than a lot of other people are.
Yeah.
And I could see, I could probably learn a lot from this guy because he's got more experience than I do in life, and I just tried to pick up on everything that he was more than gracious enough to share.
Yeah. Well, that was insightful of you, initially.
For sure. Yeah.
That's a skill in its own.
Absolutely.
To realize what you have in front of you.
Yeah.
I didn't realize how much there was. Yeah.
And so you'd done work at PlayStation prior to meeting Justin, right? That was
Yeah. So I can tie it together. Actually. So yeah, we're as they say in Latin with literature, in medias res, in the middle of things. We're starting in the middle of things in terms of meeting them, right? So I met Justin and Josh.
Yeah.
In my head when I met them, so I was like, oh, this is Naughty Dog. So Naughty Dog was a company that made one of the original PlayStation 1 games called Crash Bandicoot. I had worked with Naughty Dog.
Okay.
So when I met Josh kind of reminded me of Jason, who was the sort of the artist for Naughty Dog.
Yeah.
And then Andy Gavin, who was the engineer who went to MIT. So when I met them, I'm like, this is like repeating all over again. So I had exactly the frame in my mind of how Naughty Dog, Naughty Dog then became hugely successful. So I can talk then about that.
Sure.
So that's the immediate stress. So when I saw them, that's what it was. So I can then tell you about my background.
Yeah.
So, long story short, I was lucky enough to get on the launch team for the Sony PlayStation 1. And, and then that happened through a series of things that maybe we can go into. But the key thing with my work with PlayStation 1 was working with Naughty Dog. There was a company before PlayStation 1 called the 3DO. So the 3DO was a CD-based 3D machine.
Okay.
And I joined that company after working at Apple. And so when 3DO, when I joined them, it took a year for it to launch.
Yeah.
At launch, it failed for various reasons.
3DO did?
3DO.
Okay.
Yeah, and I did a long tech talk for Google about this, like partly why it failed.
Yeah.
There's this concept called I call it the affective threshold, that the technology of the 3DO didn't have enough power to make a 3D platformer game. And that 3D platformer game would have been a new affective, emotional experience that the 3DO couldn't fail. So for me, that's why the 3DO failed.
So did Sony 1 bring those things to the table that 3DO didn't, or are those two separate topics?
Yeah. We're sorry.
You said that the 3DO was lacking the 3D side of things.
Yeah, so that's the irony, right? So the company's called 3DO.
I know it's
Well, maybe we could call it 3D zero because it had zero. Well, I mean, it was close. Long story short, there's a number that had
many thousand polygons.
So this is where my impact on the PlayStation 1 comes in. So there's a technical threshold of 90,000 polygons processing per second to do a 3D platform. No, you're good. You're good. Yeah, so all you have to think of is there's sort of the technical power of the PlayStation needed to reach a certain number. To make a 3D platformer game.
Okay, gotcha.
So like render an experience that would be compelling to a gamer to play on the level that would drive commerce.
I see. Okay.
So it's kind of like, so here's an easier way to think.
Catch on.
Yeah, so it's an easier way to think of it. Like before the iPhone, there wasn't the experience to have email the phone on one phone.
Yeah.
And that was because the technology wasn't good enough to get there.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden technology was good for that, and then we have an iPhone.
I see.
So let's say Tesla.
Yeah.
Everyone wanted to have a battery operated car.
Yeah.
The technology wasn't good enough to get there.
Yeah.
And then finally it did, and someone knew that the technology was there and we could make it. Does that make sense?
No, totally.
That's the same thing. Okay, so that's the same thing with
I got you now, yeah.
So you had Sega Genesis, you had the Super Nintendo.
Yep.
Those were all doing 2D games.
I see.
But there wasn't enough power to do a 3D game.
I see. And so it was a power issue.
Yeah, so to do 3D games, you have to create a simulation of reality in the computer itself.
Okay.
That's how it does it.
Okay.
And then so that, if you can imagine, it takes a ton of power in the computer.
I'm thinking about playing video games in my head as you're explaining.
Okay, good.
Very, very cool.
Yeah, so I call it, there's always a technical, or I think called a technical plateau, where you can only do so much. So when you have 2D games, that's like the Genesis, the Nintendo, they try to do that 2D as good as possible. And then eventually you get this, so I take this from evolution. There's this idea of, there's sort of the stasis, and then all of a sudden there's what they call punctuated evolution, and boom, there's a new species.
Okay.
It's the same thing.
I see.
So this punctuated evolution comes from, I want to say Daniel Dennett, who's a evolutionist, and so he was trying to figure out like why there's such punctuated gaps between the fossil record, but
Yeah.
you know, it's like, you know, there's apes, then there's humans. Like, how does it do that? So it's the same thing. It's parallel in with technology. Is you know, there's these things, and then there's this punctuated thing.
Right.
So the 3DO is sort of like what, I don't know what it was. There was the Cro-Magnon man.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, whatever. So the 3DO was this sort of like almost there, but not quite human, right? And then the PlayStation was fully human. Was that?
Yeah, no, I follow.
And so that
was many of the sort of fossils that seemed like it was.
That's right, and it was
static.
close, and the 3DO was super close. I mean, and then so Naughty Dog, the company that resembled Justin and Josh, as in terms of Andy and Jason, they worked on the 3DO. And so when I worked at it, I worked with them. That was part of my job, was to work with Naughty Dog to support them on the technology.
I see.
So then the 3DO launches, and then we find out it's Cro-Magnon man. And so then it's not going to be sustainable as a species.
Yeah.
So then I'm like, okay, well, I need to find a new job.
Yeah.
So I talked to Naughty Dog, and I was like, and speaking of finding mentors, I was like, they're way smarter than me in my head. And so Naughty Dog. So Andy Gavin. So Andy Gavin is the MIT trained engineer.
Gotcha.
So I'm like, that dude's way smarter than me, and then he'll know. So I asked him, I'm like, how's this PlayStation thing? Because I kind of knew that they were working on it.
Yeah.
He's like, it's really good. And I'm like, okay, if he's saying it's really good.
Yeah, you trust it.
I trusted him. No, that was it.
Similar to Justin.
Yeah, the same.
Good. I know he's done so crazy research and thought and consideration that I don't have to worry that much.
Yeah. No, very good.
I guess
Very
flattering. He's good to go. So then Andy guy.
Yeah. So then, anyway, so long story short, then I think somehow I got either, I talked to Headhunter, they hired me. And so, I mean, we could talk about that too, but, well, I'll talk about it really quickly because it's good advice how to get a job.
Yeah.
So the Sony PlayStation was incubated in Sony Music.
Okay.
And so Sony Music had a base in Santa Monica.
Gotcha.
So that's, and then the culture of music is very corporate. So I don't know if you ever talk to musicians, they're just like, the management's always jerks and things. It's because
I just watched a video on that last night.
You know, what was it?
It was, I want to say it might have been actually, oddly enough, it might have been Jared Leto explaining how record companies deal with artists, especially when they're new. Yeah. I don't know how I got on that.
You know, it's perfect. So the way it works with this conversation is that the way the business side run is just purely corporate. And when it's purely corporate, it's purely just about the money and no caring about the people. And then the culture is very, just cold and like bottom line. And, you know, it's not creative at all.
Which sounds like it would be more opposites for trying to create something that's never existed.
Wow. So here we go. So you set me up perfectly. So they find me from 3DO, I got to a Headhunter, I think. And so then I go down from San Francisco because I was, up in San Francisco, and flew me down. I go for my interview. So I show up in my interview with like ripped shorts, multicolored Chuck Taylors, a shirt that I had spray painted Spanky from Spanking the R Gang, which is this old 1940s. And, long hair.
Yeah.
So I walk in, and the woman who was the HR director was from the corporate side.
Sure, she was excited to see
I'll tell you. Well, sorry. So, and so I go and I do my interview. So one of my interviews was with this really great guy that I was really friends with, Todd. And I go to the interview, and I mentioned I worked at Apple, and so I'd worked on various projects there. So one of them was the handheld called Newton, which was the sort of some the Cro-Magnon for the iPhone. So I worked on the Cro-Magnon for the iPhone, which was the Newton. So the guy I interviewed with had a Newton.
Okay.
So when I did my interview, I'm all, all the freak out. Like, he talks for the whole interview about his Newton.
That's how you know that you're getting the job.
I didn't say a word. Literally. So we go 40 minutes of him talking about his Newton.
Yeah.
And finally we get up to go out, and he goes, I should ask you a question. So I turned to him, dead-eyed, and I said, you can ask me when I come back.
There you go.
All right.
And so I got the job. And anyway, and then to finish this, go ahead.
That is so wild.
Yeah, and then to finish the story with the HR director, I found out later the inside, they did hire me. Then the woman, HR woman, said to the team that said, why did you waste Sony's money flying this freak down?
I knew she didn't like it for sure.
So Yeah, and so, but they did it anyway, and well, then I had fun with her. I mean, you know, she's probably a lovely lady.
Of
She's
course.
just, you know, I mean, not
People
the
are people.
perfect. Yeah. I don't, and I didn't take it personally. Well, a little bit, because when I got when I came there, you know, she's the HR, so she approves. Like,
Sure.
I needed a car, so I ended up flying back and forth, and I needed a car, and I bought a red convertible. Or not bought, but rented. Yeah.
In California.
Well, of course, but apparently it was against the rules, but I ignored the rules.
Yeah, you're the ripped shorts guys.
Yeah. So, and then eventually she's like, who owns the red convertible? So she found out and she took it away from me. And I'm like, oh,
yeah. Well,
but I had already been through most of it. So
I like how you left the guy with a rhetorical question. Yeah, or just a question mark. Like,
yeah, you know
it's
what?
coming back. Always coming back.
Yeah, well, yeah, for sure. Yeah, I use that a lot because I ended up using like a psalm structure in this when I had my big impact, which I'll reveal in a second.
Yeah,
but
sure.
but anyway, so well, we were tying it back to the PlayStation. So so we worked there for a while in Santa Monica, and then a lot of my work was working with developers on the technical end.
Mm-hmm.
So then that's how So I go meet with developers, and and that was really my role. And so I basically at one point became like one of the main technical contacts in the for the PlayStation 1. And then one of the unique qualities for my own mind is I have a really good ability, you know, just like in this conversation, we're jumping to a billion different topics.
Sure, yeah.
I have the ability to understand a billion different things at a very general sense.
Yeah.
So normally with engineering, you tend to specialize in like one.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so with the PlayStation, there's like the sound, the graphics, the central process. I knew all of it but at a very basic level.
Mm-hmm.
And so then that's how I became, you know, pretty indispensable for doing it.
Now, did you set out to study each of those individual things on your own, or like how did you come to understand each one of those parts? Because it sounds like usually it's a specialty and you had a baseline of all three. So did you set out to do that, or is it just the amount of time you spent on the subject?
Yeah, it goes back to conation. Like, and this I only figured out after I learned
I had
about
a feeling there's something.
So conation, we'll talk about that. Yeah, so at the time I didn't know. It was more instinct. So that's what conation is. It's an instinct.
Yeah.
It's just your instinctual way of how you do things.
Yeah.
So when I joined the PlayStation, I just instinctually learned all of it because this is how but my job role wasn't that per se. In fact, my job review was like, quit butting into other people's business. Pretty much will stay in your lane. But that's just not how my brain works.
I don't really believe in that either.
Well, yeah. So then later, when they sent over engineers from Sony, and they're like, "How does he know all the system?" And the way I do it is, I don't know. I know a little bit about all of them. I don't go in. So and then when I need to know a lot about whatever, then I go in and learn a lot about whatever. So so then what
it's like just in time almost.
Yeah, I'm a just in time multi-processor. Actually, I ran into a student yesterday who graduated in 2012, and then. They use the word multiprocessor because a lot of students didn't understand me back then because I didn't have this cognitive insight about that I multiprocess, but that's how they understood me. So that's how I do it. So it's instinctual. So that's like it, you know, career wise, I just instinctually did it, and then it was very valuable because I had that breadth. I could go and solve any problem essentially based on whatever they wanted.
Kind of the odd thing about PlayStation is that you mentioned Sony Music, and it might just be my own ignorance, but I feel like I can speak for a lot of people where, from like a consumer standpoint, I don't think a lot of people really put it together that Sony PlayStation was Sony Music. That they're this, you know.
I definitely didn't until you just said it.
Obviously, but there's that passion, and that was sort of the baseline. And
is it like the Walkman and like some of their
correct? Well, no. It was where it was incubated was where they did they bought recording artists. So you know they're publishing.
Oh, okay.
So Sony Music owned I forget which music label. So they had all of the posters of all the bands that they had signed. So it was that, and back to what you were saying, the Mars band that you mentioned.
30 Seconds to Mars.
30 Seconds.
Yeah.
So they signed bands. So that was the Sony music that signed bands.
Yeah.
So Sony just needed, when you're in the startup mode, back to that, they needed a space to incubate it. So we started there, then eventually we got a space up in the Bay Area where traditionally the games were developed, and so we moved.
Kind of sounds like a fancier version of the Fail Cube a little bit. You know, it's like, hey, we got space.
Beautiful connection. No, exactly. It was a fancy. Yeah. One of the things was we had like a snack.
It's also cool you went to the Fail Cube after being at Sony.
After meeting Andy.
I didn't even connect that. That's a brilliant.
You have the ability to be like, let's get down and dirty again. You know, like.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, back to. Oh yeah, no. Yeah, that was great. I love being. Well, in retrospect, it was pretty too much dirty. I think now, I mean, it's too much dust. But I think I would be.
It was not humane. It was not humane.
A lot of OSHA probably violations going on.
Started in a dungeon basement on Rockwell and
I was only there for one session with you, and that is exactly the vibe. Yes, it was just like we just need space to do a thing.
Our treadmill. The one treadmill we had, it was a Reebok treadmill that sounded like it was in half on it, because I think it was from Walmart or something like that. And it had a menthol strip that you could pull off of a cord if you're going to pass out to smell it so you could wake up. And our treadmill was in front of a coal chute that still had coal in it from when the building burnt coal to heat the building. And, initially we were just happy to have a gym. So we didn't really put two and two together. We were just excited. And
it was the same thing.
Absolutely. You guys were like, man, we can just build this product, or we can just like put our creativity into something. We're so excited. And then looking back, you're like, man, that was really not good. I'm really happy we weren't there, too much.
Absolutely.
No, the other thing I had a question for you is that with the Crash Bandicoot, what was your transition like from initially starting at Sony and then like building that game, or being such a big part of that game? Because I imagine it's probably quite different than you showing up like very disheveled and this thing with the HR lady, and like I'm sure eventually they sort of figured out who you were. So how do we go from you getting that job strangely how you did to being such a big impact?
Thanks, that's a great question. So then the basic problem I was assigned to do was to just help develop games for the launch on the technical side. So that was basically what I was hired for. So that meant I worked with all the developers, and so having worked at 3DO, I worked closely then with Naughty Dog, and then secondarily I knew how good they were, and so I guess I was watching some of the behind the scenes at Naughty Dog. So I worked on and all that they were doing. So But my involvement was on the Sony side. So the way the game industry works is there's the developer and then the publisher. So just similar to the music model where there's the publisher of the music and then the artist. So I wasn't on the artist side; I was on the publisher side. And so when I was working with them, so I was working with all the developers, and then because I knew how smart they were, I would take a lot of the cues from them, and sort of this is one of the techniques that's maybe good, is that if you have a group, so we have a group of developers, and you want to get all of them to be good, one thing is you focus on the best one, so that then what you do for them sprinkles down to everybody else. I suppose it's I was a personal trainer for a while, and I had a really good trainer named Dave England up in he taught boxing and Pilates. And that's how he taught his Pilates class. He would find the best student, and then the level of difficulty was pegged to that person. So so it's the same. So with Naughty Dog then, so I knew that. So that was a lot of what it was. And so the first time I went to Naughty Dog to go meet with them, is they just used a lot of science to measure the performance of the PlayStation. So they just spent like 6 months seeing like what the PlayStation could do before they did any development.
Interesting.
Which is so a very scientific approach. To just get the numbers. And so then anyway, so long story short, so that was going on. So they were developing the game and they were doing that on their own. So I wasn't involved so much in the creative side. It was on the the Sony side. So part of that then was telling Sony on the inside that, hey, you need to pay attention to them. And they were kind of doing a bit of a stealth mode in terms of what they were doing. And so, so that was part of my role.
Like if the government's creating a new plane for the military, they're not telling anyone about it. Is that what you mean by the stealth mode?
Yeah. So no one really knew what they were making. Not even Sony kind of knew what they did. But because I had worked with them before, I knew a bit more.
Yeah.
And so then Bernie Stoller, who was the vice president there, so it's really him, if you look at the documentary, he was my boss's boss. So I would talk with him, and then so then eventually, so a lot of that on the internal side was just making them aware of it and supporting them internally. But really the big impact, and this is the part that, in retrospect, that really impacted things, was we were getting close to the launch, whatever the year was, 95, I want to say, at E3, the first E3.
Yeah.
I guess it would be because it's a Sony event.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's the first E3's coming up, and then Kutaragi, who's the CEO, designer of the PlayStation, he, he's all nervous because we don't know the PlayStation is going to be successful.
The 3DO had just...
Yeah, the 3DO fell.
Like huge vote of confidence.
And so you, from this podcast, my instinct is to just jump around everywhere.
Yeah.
And the different topics. So I was doing the same thing at Sony while I was working. So I was developing and supporting all the developers. But at the same time, I started working with this guy, Bert, on making a graphics synthesizer that would take the music and then create visuals. So when you play the PlayStation, it could play an audio CD. Okay. So I was creating this little app that, as it played, it would just show random on your TV, random graphics. So I called it, I think Blue
Cloud.
Blue Clouds. Thank you. Jeez, I can't even remember. So I called it, codenamed the project Blue Clouds. And so Kutaragi finds out that I'm working on this.
Kutaragi, the guy who...
The CEO and architect. So he's like the head Japanese guy.
Yeah.
So he finds out I'm working on this and sends me an email.
He was bad.
He was mad at me. He goes, E3 might fail and you're off here working on this project. So, and I just left out a lot out of the story.
Yeah.
I was pissed. Okay, because I'm like, and the reason why, I have to build up why I was pissed.
They're the CEO.
Well, I have to say, all right, so we'll have to pause it because I have to backfill the story. So I mentioned I'd worked at Apple earlier. So my first job out of college was at Apple Computer. So when I joined Apple Computer, I was with my friend Hardy, and he had this document for this thing called Warhol. Long story short, Warhol was the marketing document for QuickTime. So QuickTime at the time was the latest technology of doing digital video.
Gotcha. I had to think back to that name when I saw it in the email.
Yeah.
Because it's been a while. But
yeah, it's been a while. It's been
rebranded.
Well, no, it's been, I think, decommissioned. They don't need it anymore. So, so QuickTime,
a huge part of
at the time,
what we did.
Yeah,
to play video.
To play video. That was the first library to play digital video.
Yeah.
In like 1993.
Yeah.
So I joined that team because I'm like, this is cool. So anyway, but the big impact on the PlayStation is what I'm trying to set this up for.
Yeah, sure.
So when I worked at Sony, I also would write articles, technical articles. And so in that group, I used to play games and wrote some stuff when I was a kid and stuff. So like mostly like Atari 2600 games and things. And then some arcade games. So I was sort of a gamer. There was another colleague named Brigham who was a hardcore like gamer engineer. So there's this thing, and I'll have to explain this. There's a thing in technology. There's a technology discussion now. There's a thing with programming where normally you have to use an operating system. So the iPhone has like the iOS, which is the iPhone operating system. Windows is an operating system for PCs. The Macintosh OS for them, right? So normally that's standard practice. And so at Apple, that was like religion. You must basically use the operating system to then interface with the computer. And there's various reasons for that. And mostly it's just so that like you have more control as a company if you have the operating system, because then you can do things behind the scenes with it's similar to like if you're driving a car, like don't realign the engine, or don't
you want like all Toyotas are probably going to share a bunch of the same components.
Correct.
Because at scale it doesn't make sense for like your Civic to have a different set of parts in your Corolla because like downstream, you're thinking about maintaining these cars over time. You want to have like a unified pipeline for being able to manage change through like a huge system. So going through the OS, going through the operating system helps you manage what everybody on top of you is doing so that you can evolve it in a reasonable way.
I see.
So that was sort of standard practice, that there's the user, there's an operating system, which is controlled by the company, and then there's the hardware. And so that's what you call a design problem, where like your design problem is, I want to make the user experience as good as possible. So by having the operating system, you're sort of guaranteeing for the most part that you can deliver a consistent thing. And Apple was known for that, you know, it doesn't break, it doesn't crash, all that. So, but what happened was there's a different, with games, the games has a different design need. Games need speed as their most important thing, more than stability. So this is the course. So maybe there's something in your life that's the equivalent. I don't know, or you can think of. But it's just this basic tension between one thing is if you want stability and flexibility, use an operating system. But if you want speed and you don't need so much stability, then you would use a different way of doing it.
Well, sometimes there's only so much time for things you want to accomplish. And that's how I see it with lifting or jiu-jitsu. You know, sometimes you have to do things slow.
Trade-off. It's a trade-off. That's the idea. So maybe let's go with trade-off. So it's a trade-off. So the trade-off with an operating system, if you do the trade-off is you get a unified user experience, but you give up speed. There you go. Okay,
I got you.
So then at Apple, now going back to Apple prided itself culturally on great user experience as opposed to the PC. So there was a huge cultural resistance to not using the operating system.
I could see that.
And then I already told you that I like to break rules. Back to the Sony story. So Brigham, it was sort of the brilliant engineer, and I know enough to engineer to be proficient. So he's like, well, one of the things we could do if you want to make a nice, fast game is don't use the operating system. So we decided to write an article, the article being published by Apple. So an Apple published article in this magazine called Develop to say, here's how you write directly to the screen. So here's how to write graphics by not going through the operating system. Right? The operating group just freaked out. They're like, you can't do this. This is wrong, blah, 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 blah. But I knew it was right. So I fought back and I'm like, no, this is okay. And then they're like, but if you do this, it'll break this, if you do it. So one of the things is if you do that, you can't use Windows, right? So Mac was known for everything through. And if you use it, it might cause glitches. So I was like, all right, that's fair enough. I said, the article was going to only be very short. So I said, I made a deal. I negotiated. I said, we'll spend the first 3 pages saying, don't do this. And then the last page of 3 pages is here's how you do it. So I structured that deal. And so then we published that article called Writing Directly to the Screen, where it's like, don't do this. But if you really have to, here's how you do it. And so the article is one of the first game articles at Apple.
Gotcha.
And then so really my role was just being the trickster. I really identified with the character of the trickster. And so I was the trickster that, through working with Brigham so he's the lead author because it was his code. And then I'm in this case, the negotiator. And so I went through that experience. So I'm telling you all that experience to tell you, and this is really one of the biggest impacts I had on the PlayStation, but it's also how Apple Computer, my work at Apple, impacted the launch of the PlayStation. So if we rewind
you're talking about E3,
the launch. So we're a month or two out from the launch of the PlayStation and E3. Kutaragi sends me the email like, "Why are you working on the musical app?" And I'm pissed because in the build up to the E3, through my work with Naughty Dog, they wanted direct access to the hardware, and Kutaragi was insisting on an operating system. So he was insisting on the design of having it so that he could have long-term a good user experience protocol. And so that's what he was doing, and he wasn't listening to anybody about learning, getting access to the hardware, getting access to these Sony libraries. So libraries is just another part of the operating system. Libraries, operating system, it's all the sort of same thing. So when Kuragi sent me that email, I was angry. So this is where anger can be a good thing.
Yeah.
But so I responded to him and I said, because he basically said E3 might be ruined because somehow I'm working on this. And the reason he was worried about me is because, like, as I mentioned earlier, knew all of the technical stuff. So for him, I was like the most important tech point person because I knew all the systems and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
So he comes hard at me with this email. So I respond and I'm like, okay, Kutaragi didn't give me access to the hardware. E3 won't be ruined by Angus and the Blue Cloud. So Angus is my nickname back then. I use a lot of pseudonyms and things. So so that's this. So I mentioned my rhetorical device of using a psalm. So psalms are things. The way that it's structured as a psalm, you repeat the same thing at the end. So my second paragraph was Kutaragi didn't give me access to the software or the libraries. The software of the libraries. E3 won't be ruined by Angus and the Blue Clouds.
I see.
And then I said, Kutaragi didn't give me access to the Japanese engineers. E3 won't be ruined by Angus and the Blue Clouds. Kutaragi didn't give me access to the LSI engineers. E3 won't be ruined by Angus and the Blue Clouds. So I wrote that email, sent it to him and this is what's amazing for him. So somewhat it's a story about me, but it's not really in a lot of ways because it's really about him.
He was open enough to this feedback.
Within 2 weeks, immediately full access to hardware diagrams. Immediately full access to all the software.
Yeah.
Immediately he sent 2 engineers to America that we had no access to. And then that was the so I was basically the catalyst through my rhetorical devices, anger, and most importantly it was my ability in fight at Apple to know how to fight back, and then also to know that good design, and like I said, to Kutaragi's credit, he listened.
Yeah, and
so
you also didn't come at him in a defensive way. Even though you're angry, it was more just
courage. Courage to be. That was
and you're stating what's happening.
So good, and then now you remind me when we were talking earlier about the Catholic thing. So this is the courage to be. So this guy Paul Tillich, who's the 20th century greatest theologian out of Princeton, he has a book called The Courage to Be, and that's what he said is I had the courage to be. I was just because it's back to ways of being. My way of being was just no fear. Yeah. And then that goes back to control by love. So when you're not controlled by love, your courage to be is, and then I was real. So it's not only that was the other thing. I was real. I wasn't fabricating. I was dead on with what I was saying. It was assessment, and my action too was measured. Right. I used a rhetorical device. I didn't make it personal. I just made it. I used the Bible. I used the psalm structure to convince him, but it's his credit, right? Yeah. Because that's the job of the CDO is to be like all his workers, and I'm like, I handed him. Yeah. Then eventually, we could fast forward it. The rest isn't as interesting for me, but after the launch was successful and all this, I could ask for whatever I wanted. So I asked to go work in Tokyo. So that I worked for a year working for him. Yeah. And then I went to his cube one day, and pinned on the wall was my email. Because it was literally the blueprint for what he needed to do. You probably
sent out to him. I mean, in other ways too, but I'm sure that email, it told him a lot of things about you in just one email.
Oh, yeah. Well, and so this is interesting too, because there's a bit of a, what do you call it? Hamartia, which is my own tragic flaw that we could talk a bit about too. But sure. But he, so that, but the big thing is later on, there's this movement called open source. Mm. And so it
sounds familiar.
So open source is where you let, it's normally when you write code, it's controlled by a company. When you make it open source, anyone can access it.
I see.
And so that's what I was essentially advocating for way early is open sourcing. Mm. I mean, in this case, it's open sourcing it within the ecosystem of Sony and the publishers. Yeah. But he just wanted Sony and none of the developers to have it. So essentially what I did was break the wall so that it was open source within the publisher and the developers. Right. So that's essentially my impact. So it's a form of early open sourcing.
These days, like you have to sign away a bunch of your rights when you become like a Sony developer, don't you? In order to publish on.
Oh, probably, yeah.
And
So,
probably when you sign that, then you get brought into
then
the fold.
then in the fold. So it's a mild form of it. And but anyway, the big thing is if you look at the history of that Naughty Dog.
Yeah.
So Andy Gavin, there's one of the videos, the lead engineer, he talks about there's a shadowy fellow who visits him and gives him these things.
Yeah.
So part of actually talking with you about it is I always wanted to give the rest of the story because he just has his experience from the developer side.
Yeah.
He didn't know what was going on internally with me advocating email, and then this email and all this stuff. So that was, and of course he doesn't know.
Crazy. It almost sounds like a book, like it's a chapter by chapter. There's so many underlying factors that go into just the start of this game.
There's a cinema piece.
Yeah, I mean, so that's why, so thank you, because I've never really fully unpacked this story. And, Andy posted a blog, so I did put a comment there about, the Sony side and maybe with this video. But, and sometimes when I lecture, I show it with a video of where in the video, there's like a man in black who, so I'm the man in black today, I dressed for it. So who slips him. But the other thing is, early on, they said Naughty Dog was getting special treatment. It wasn't so much they were getting special treatment or favoritism. It was more anyone at that point could get it. But it's one of those things where, like, with training, it's like, you're not going to give something too difficult to someone walking in off the streets. You build them up before you expose them. It's the same thing with developers. It's like for me to go to some other developer and say, here's the source code, it would actually make it worse for them because they wouldn't know what to do with it.
You can give someone out here the best program in the world, the most advanced, it would be so overwhelming.
Yeah.
It wouldn't make it into the second work.
There you go. It's exactly the same problem with developers. So probably I just bring this up because over the years we didn't really talk about it because there's these rumors of favoritism. It wasn't so much favoritism. It was more like measuring who can benefit the most from getting the hardware diagrams and getting the software, and they were. And so that's the and then really ultimately that's this insight about design, right? So what happened with me was this idea of design thinking, that computer science isn't computer science, it's computer design. It's both. So, we talked earlier where Andy was measuring the performance. That's pure science. Like, you do an experiment, you see what it does, you get an output. But then when you're deciding what to do, that's a design problem where, and the same thing probably with your work, you have to design based on what's going on. What's the trade-offs between how much do I challenge them? How much do I don't? So it's really design thinking, I guess, with what you do as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, thanks for making it sound that nice.
No, I
that's what you're doing, even if you didn't have a label for it.
No, absolutely, you're designing.
We spend a lot of time.
I know you do, because I heard that with your work when I saw your podcast earlier. Like you really design it. You interview your customers, and then you design a program based on what your experience, what they need. Yeah, that's totally design.
And then each client, I mean, each trainer and probably every gym does it differently. But the way I prefer to do it is I train my people one-on-one. So I'm there looking at every single thing they do. But as we gain a little bit more trust with each other in the sense that the client knows how to do some basic things, or they know how to do warm-ups, or even...
They're not going to hurt themselves immediately.
Yeah, or somebody like Justin, who we've trained together for a decade, I can trust Justin to warm up all the way to his first hard set and do it alone while I'm updating our computer, taking the results we got from the last month or month and a half of training, and then putting it into the next month and month and a half. And there's a lot of consideration going into just these basic numbers of what we think he could do or what might be too much. And
you're a designer.
Yeah.
No, that's what that is.
In a very weird way.
Yeah, no, it's exactly it. No, I mean, I know you don't really self-identify. But that is so back to ways of being, ways of doing.
Yeah.
The ways of being is that the way you're being. And that's really what in terms of your value of coming to Rockwell versus somewhere else in terms of a gym, is you have that way of being where you're designing things and you listen. And that's another one, you listen.
Yeah.
So, that's.
And the design aspect of it that you were talking about, I kind of cut you off a little bit.
No, that's okay.
It was, you're talking about, there's sort of like the system side of it about what it does. And then the design side of it, you were saying, is that the experience side of it? That's the side of the person who's playing the game.
Yeah. So that's good.
The things that you're developing, is that?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. So in terms of design, well, we can get to the game side too, and I'll do that but just to close out the hardware chapter, the design part is more, really what I was saying in terms of design was getting rid of the OS is a design decision. That's all. So back then they thought of it as a science, that it's a science, therefore there's one truth. You must use an operating system.
Okay.
They didn't have the design mentality that, oh, no, all the computers
is there trade-offs.
It's trade-offs.
Yeah.
So that's what I taught Kutaragi. That's what I taught Apple. And I don't know how I got it. There's something, maybe it was working on the QuickTime team, I think. It was early on when the QuickTime team was this world-class thing.
Yeah.
I remember a few epiphanies and working on it. I'm like, oh, it's just, I was able to switch to be like, the whole thing. It was definitely working on the QuickTime team, because I remember when I was working on QuickTime and I was thinking it was a science.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, oh, there's one way to do it. And then finally I was like, oh, there's no one truth. There's no one solution. It's just all design.
Because you ran into a couple different walls.
Yeah. Very good. Yep.
Like,
I was digging into the QuickTime code and trying to understand it and be like, there's one truth. And then all of a sudden I'm like, oh no, there's no one truth. It's just design. It's just a bunch of trade-offs. And so then it's always, so when I teach programming and computer science now, I'm like, first of all, it's not a science. Well, it's not fair. It's really a blend of the science. So like,
that was my next question. Is that, do you still view it as you rely on the science aspect of it, but then you combine the design side of it?
Yes, absolutely. And so this is where I would put all the credit on Naughty Dog and Andy Gavin. I mean, that's why I have to sort of disambiguate what my contribution was. But he's the one who had that scientific, like, measure the PlayStation. He's the one who showed me that in terms of it. Because so I'm not so much the scientist. I'm more the trickster.
Andy Gavin, he did the work to know the rules, and
that's right.
And then you get to break the rules after.
So one of the funny things is then, I did the whole thing in Tokyo and then kind of failed out of that, which we'll talk about in a second.
Sure.
But then came back and worked on our creative side. So then in that creative side, I then reworked with Naughty Dog. Yeah. And so one of the things is I would give them advice on their design and then they were very resistant to it. So, because my design philosophy was different from theirs anyway, so that's more my mindset is more design thinking versus the science side. And so that's then coming full circle.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's perfect timing. Actually, coming full circle back to you because that's it. Saying I talk about me. So when I met him, I realized he brought that science part that I don't have. So So one of the things in terms of working in teams is you have to be humble and know where you end and where others can. So in that case, I was blessed to just work along and be influenced by Naughty Dog, and Andy Gavin, and so now it was when I met him that time, I was like, okay, I can work with him because he brings all this talent that I don't in terms of how he thinks, his science side, his programming side, complementary. Yeah. And so then that's why, of course, I would work because it becomes complementary. Yeah. And that's some humility where you learn like, maybe I have ambition to do what Naughty Dog did creatively, but I can't do that, but I can work over in this area to support them, help them, and then work internally on the Sony side to be the trickster to disrupt everything. And I ran into someone yesterday who works at Sony, and they're like, they went back to the normal. They don't do it that way anymore. So that disruptive thing, because I think once a business up and running, then you need to go back to this more stable thing. So
it's interesting how that works because early on there really aren't a lot of expectations, and you might have certain things set, but then they get broke over and over, and you kind of go back, and then you'll have rules, and you'll break them again. You kind of side with the gym.
Yeah, and so tell me about the gym.
Well, in the beginning it was just full chaos, and then we've been in gym now 10 years, and in the middle of it, I really thought I knew how it worked. And then in year 8, I was like, no, that's definitely not how it works, like at all. And then when we got to year 9 and 10, I was like, okay, I think this is how it works. And now we have a lot of information from before, like certain things were successful, other things were, I wouldn't say a failure, but they just didn't work as well.
Yeah.
And now I kind of just avoid the things that cause pain, but I'm also open-minded to whatever does to help us get to the next step.
Yeah, very good. Yeah.
I just kind of follow the path a little bit.
Yeah.
It sounds
that's
like
humility.
Yeah, and it sounds like that's kind of what you're talking about with Sony, except for when Sony's successful and they have now like all this money involved and then all these pressures.
Yeah.
And
Well, yeah.
you have to, I would imagine, get more stringent.
Well, I think it goes, the evolution and punctuated equilibrium makes sense, right? Again, so it's that moment in time with PlayStation 1 was a punctuated evolution. Now you have a species, which is this, now it's just about stabilizing it.
Yeah.
And so then you go back to the old, stabilizing.
You're like trying to exploit, it's like exploration versus exploitation.
Algorithm. Yeah. There's an algorithm called exploration versus
exploitation.
Exploitation versus.
So like once you've got your ecological niche and you know that the money's coming in, you found product.
When you
want to like just make the most efficient streamlines to extract the most.
So then that also explains then why I would land up in a dirty thing with Justin because and to go back to humility, that like that's the way to do. And just if I think we should just talk real quick on the Greek tragedy of my work at Sony. So we talked about how my brain jumps around in this interview. We jump around. So the job I got quote unquote promoted to was on one thing. So there's with conation, when you do something against you become like a machine.
Yeah.
So I couldn't do it. I literally couldn't do it.
Heated principle, or
it's related to you get promoted to a level of incompetence. And so it was really being promoted to an environment that didn't complement my intuitive style.
Yeah.
And then there was also an affective component, which was the social point of being in Japan. So it's not just conative, but it was conative. I was doing one thing, and it was also about
environmental.
And it was just, they promoted me to a job where I had to be either Justin or Andy Gavin. That's not a job I could do. I needed to be the trickster. And So I couldn't do it. And then my relationship with, and it's always my failure with that was then my relationship with Kuragi then defrayed because he couldn't understand.
Yeah.
I don't think he could understand. He couldn't understand me, and I couldn't understand me. So it's like
that is exactly what I saw immediately with Bill. Is that I also feel that like I'm not very well understood.
Right.
And I was like, oh, Bill's gone through a lot of these challenges already. I want to really, really soak up everything that he's learned so that I can hopefully save myself a lot of trouble.
Yeah, and then he can also help you elaborate on your strengths.
Yeah.
And then also help you avoid other things that
are
problematic in ways that...
So I am benefiting from your tragedy.
Well, and so I think that goes back to Greek philosophy that, in terms of growing as a person, we all have tragedies, and so that was one of them. But I would then have one other quick story of Japan. There was another game I worked on which was called Blasto, and I had this other amazing engineer that in my life was this gentleman named Dylan Cuthbert, who worked on the Star Fox, which was a Super Nintendo game.
Yeah, I had to remember what that was.
Yeah,
and then played it. What was that?
It was actually It was 3D on the Super Nintendo. Yeah.
So the engineer was this guy Dylan Cuthbert, and he was probably 18 when he did or something like that. So then he came and he worked.
He was really young.
Yeah, and then when I worked with him, he was a bit older, but he worked on my a game called Blasto. So when I came back to work on the creative side, we made this game Blasto, which was trying to, by the way, compete with Crash, and because they were both 3D games, but and then Crash went out, so instead of Blasto being the mascot, it was Crash. But anyway, the other good story I have, and this feeds into like why I teach. So sometimes students ask me like, why aren't you in the game industry anymore? So part of it, just a little bit of the sort of tragic fall.
Yeah.
Usually what I say, that's like King Lear, where like you're like, oh, I didn't know who I was, and so through that tragedy, it's like you get exposed to who you really are, your history.
Yeah.
Like through that tragedy, I learned like, oh, I'm a multitasker, so that job wouldn't work for me.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's just a fun story of why I teach. I'm traveling. So Dylan then worked with Nintendo, so he knew Miyamoto. So for those who don't know, Miyamoto, designer of Donkey Kong, all the Mario games, Zelda games. So that's who Miyamoto, probably, the icon of all icons and game designers.
Yeah.
So Dylan was, when I was in Japan, Dylan was traveling through Japan, and then he was going to Kyoto, and I went with him. And so we went to Kyoto, and that's where Nintendo's headquarters are. And we just happened to be there the day that they shipped Mario 64, which was on the Super Nintendo 64, the day he shipped it. So they're in party mode. So we land up at an inn in Kyoto with Miyamoto, and then also the designer of Super Metroid was there. His name escapes me but long story short, so we have this great dinner, and I end up talking to Miyamoto for like an hour.
Wow.
And after I talked to him, he's like, "You're not a designer." In the traditional game designer sense. He goes, "You're a philosopher." So ever since that moment, that's essentially what I do. Is he told me that, and I'm like, so that's why I'm in academia. Is I'm what I call a field philosopher of video games. So I still have design. I still do design. So, but it's not like my main identity is really this. So it's like everything we talked about, like philosophical thought, but while also doing some design.
Yeah.
And then that was the impact of how I landed up, being in education and his impact on me. So my mentor was Miyamoto. I mean, he didn't know it.
But you saw him as that.
Yeah.
Did Miyamoto think of himself as a philosopher?
No. He was, so here's another great story with, so he was competitive with Crash. So at the first E3, I was there on the floor. So when basically the floor is this huge thing with all these booths that show the games.
Yeah.
So I was in there early because I was helping set up, and he shows up, and then he was purposely there to play Crash because he viewed it as a competition to him. So then he played it for like 60 seconds, and then he walked away smiling. And the reason why is because he's very competitive with design. He wanted to make the first true free roaming 3D platformer.
Yeah.
Crash was sort of on this tube, so it was still 3D, but it wasn't fully free roaming.
It's like 2.5.
So Miyamoto was happy because
It was satisfying to him that it
wasn't.
Thought it was.
Yep. So I was there. I still remember it. I'm like, and I remember thinking like,
oh no,
why did he? Well, no, it wasn't. Oh no, I was like, why did he only play for 60 seconds?
Really short.
And I was like, I was only in retrospect. I was like, oh, he's super competitive. I mean, he's just nice, whatever guy. But he's like, but he's like a Michael Jordan. He's like, he's got that killer instinct that you wouldn't even know, right? And so that's why is because he just wanted to know that he was the pioneer for the full open roaming 3D platformer. And so anyway, so that's his, impact on me in terms of that's why I teach now is that getting that insight in terms of identity and back to even King Lear. King Lear, the whole moral of the story is that he thinks at the beginning of King Lear that he knows who he is. He's got this kingdom, he has 3 daughters, and then 2 of the daughters tell him bullshit, which is basically what he wants to hear, and then the one daughter speaks truth, speaks love. Remember when I said love is being real, but he doesn't accept her. He refuses it because then eventually he realizes gets revealed what his true self is. And when you begin to be true to yourself, then, so part of meeting with Miyamoto was I thought, oh, I'm a designer and I can be as good as Miyamoto. And part of it is like, oh, wait, that's not reality of who I am.
Were you initially disappointed when he told you that you were not a designer?
No, I was more maybe a little bit like it's like, oh, okay, I don't speak the language of a full-on game designer, right? And so it was a little bit, but not a lot. It was more freeing, a lot, because it's like, oh, that's kind of who I am.
Quite jarring.
Better to know the truth.
Not jarring. Again, mild, just more like, oh.
Yeah,
I can't, because I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do.
Trying to figure out where you fit in, and he helped establish where you failed fast in the design.
He was my boss character. That was like, in a video game sense of the boss. So like, this is, and then just a quick fun story was at the meeting, I'm like, okay, this is one of the highlights of my life. I will never have this again. And so we're eating, and then finally they have this, they take out this, like a wooden stick that had this spur, a sparrow. They put the stick through it and they fry it. So they take it out and there's, like 20 people there.
Yeah.
They pass it around. Nobody would eat it.
Yeah. You ate it though, right? Hell yeah.
Trickster. So I'm sitting there. I'm like, this is the one in a lifetime thing. At first and then encouraged, right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, fuck it. So I took the sparrow. I ate the head off.
There you go.
And I was in the hospital
That's
the
like
next
some
week, though.
Amish.
That's what?
You got food poisoning from the sparrow?
Yeah, so the next week, I might go to this 90-year-old Sony doctor.
Yeah.
And he's like, here's 7 medicines. So I'm like, which one's the antibiotic? Because in the, there they had like, one was like an antacid, one was a vitamin, one might have been a candy, I don't know. And then and I'm like, so yeah, sure enough, whatever he gave me, it cleared it right up.
I'm the king of getting food poisoning at age.
Oh, are you?
Yeah.
Sorry to hear. Yeah.
No, I think I went on one trip and maybe didn't get it, but that's because we were only there for a couple of days.
Yeah, I hear
Like
you.
a trip where we kind of hopped around a lot.
Yeah.
Where I didn't get it. But anytime I've been there longer than like 4 or 5 days.
Yeah, it's hard to sometimes.
It's brutal.
When I was there, actually, thanks for mentioning that, because that was another thing when I lived in Japan. One time I was out for a whole week. I might have had malaria.
Really bad. The first time I got it, Katie had to bribe a pharmacist in Vietnam. Not a lot of money, but she had to pay for more than just a prescription.
Yeah.
The pharmacist knew that Katie was like Americanized, and so she was just like, "Well, hey, what else can you give me? Like, I gotta,
we got to take care of
those
things. Yeah,
outside of my jobs." But it was worth it, the $20 or whatever she gave.
Oh, of course.
I did have a random question for you, but I'm curious if it has any connection. But you mentioned in your email to me when you're just kind of explaining a little bit about yourself that there was sort of a mental health aspect of your life and sort of like epiphany to that.
Yeah.
Did that like transition from you realizing that you weren't as much of a designer and more of like a field philosopher? Did that happen at the same time, or was that a later thing in life that you went through?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for asking that. I'm really impressed with your listening, by the way.
Oh, thanks.
You're adopting the word field philosopher.
Yeah,
not a lot of people know that. You're great.
No,
it was actually there's this song Rowan Chapel.
Chapel Row.
Chapel Row. Thank you.
Yeah.
So
he's got a weird story about that.
You do?
Yes.
Yeah, go with that.
Well, it's really quick, but last year, randomly, this producer from Lollapalooza reached out to the gym and said that Chapel had asked for people that look like us or like weightlifters that are tattooed or just look different to be on stage with her for her Lollapalooza performance. And so we sent off like 8 photos of people that we knew, and I put myself in there and my wife in there because I was like, well, they're gonna pick one of the people from the gym. I'd love to just be in the background. And then they got back to us and they were like, we picked you, your wife, and then this lady named Inez, who I'm gonna have her on the podcast. She actually just won the Arnold for strongman, strongwoman. And she's actually the strongest woman in North America right now.
I looked that up.
Did you? Yeah.
Because she was on, in one of your shows. And
I think I mentioned her. I don't think she's on yet. I mentioned her. But anyways, it was us 3, and we literally went on stage with her for 4 or 5 of her songs for Lollapalooza, and it was...
Were you on for Good Luck, Babe?
I am not sure. I'll have to ask Katie.
So this is the segue.
Anyways, yeah.
Okay, so I got a perfect. This is total synchronicity because I figured it out this morning, so this is a little freaky.
It's fresh.
That's wild.
Totally fresh. So the reason I bring her up because you're asking like what my mental. So I'll tie it all in.
Yeah.
So good luck, babe. Yeah. So so my mental health thing. So when I was in college. There's a thing called the Great Books Program. So the Great Book Program is like scholars picked like what are considered great books. So obviously King Lear is a great book.
Yeah.
And so you basically sit like this, like what we're doing, but it would be we're talking about a great book.
Yeah.
So the one I had was the Iliad. Okay, so the Iliad is by Homer, not Homer Simpson. So that's my joke with students. It's the Homer, the one named Homer. The original. The old school rapper Homer. He was the original rapper, right? Because he sings it. He's the old school rapper. The OG rapper Homer. That's what I'm going to refer to him now. So we were talking about it, and I read it, and then I had this epiphany about that. Basically, long story short, the Iliad's a fable.
Yeah.
So a fable is you read a story and then it has a moral message for you, or like a message. And what is the message? It's all about how to deal with the anger in your life.
Yeah.
And then because he goes through all these stages where he's angry at the beginning because the world's unfair, and by the end he accepts it, and that's how it ends. So basically that was my insight that this book's a fable.
Yeah.
So I go to class, and remind you, like, I'm way deep at this. So I bring this way deep, and I have no personal awareness that I'm like coming in off the deep end.
Yeah.
And everyone else is, it's a school where drinking's the normal thing.
Yeah.
Heterosexuality's the normal thing.
Yeah.
Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So I go to class, and I'm like, the teacher opens up with, "What's the book about?" And so I'm like, "The book's about life."
Mm-hmm.
And everyone laughed because they thought I was trying to be cheeky.
Yeah.
Like, it's just about life or whatever.
Yeah.
But it was a setup for me to tell that it's this fable, blah, blah. And so in that moment, the world stopped. So there's the song in Good Luck Babe, Chappell Roan, called "Stop the World."
Mm-hmm.
And I just listened to the lyrics this morning because I really love the melody.
Yeah.
And I talked about it because in class, because it has this thing, what I call resonance, where the song literally stops, like physically stops at the end because the producer made it.
Yeah.
So I talk about it in terms of resonance, but I listened to the lyrics this morning and I was like, oh, that's what she's talking about. And I'll just explain it in a second. So in that moment when I was reading the Iliad, the world stopped because what I saw was, in that moment, was I was intending the steeper thing, but they were interpreting what I'm saying in a completely different way.
Yeah, yeah.
And then it made me realize, like, oh my God, I'm never really existing.
Yeah.
Right? Because everyone is determining what my identity is in the moment.
Yeah.
And even though my intention is all this, that's not being factored into their interpretation.
Yeah, there's like irony there because you're trying so hard. You're putting so much.
There's irony as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
But the experience for me was the world stopped and I realized, oh my God, I don't exist. And then this is where the mental health comes in.
Yeah.
I don't exist. I'm completely determined by outside forces.
Yeah.
And I'm at a college I don't like. A bunch of frat people. I mean, we're all beautiful, nice people, but it's not me.
I know what you
and then I'm like, I'm not playing sports because I was a high sport athlete. And what's that?
This is Notre Dame.
Yeah, so the University of Notre Dame, which is, I really love it. And anyway, this was the gift it gave me because the teacher, this woman, Janet Smith, oh my God. I mean, so she was my Homer because she was this who I was talking. So anyway, what happened then, I went into this cycle of like, oh my God, my life is ruined. Because then, you're like 20. I made all these decisions. I'm like 20 and like I'm not playing sports. I wanted to play sports. I'm in a pre-medical degree. I don't want to be in the pre-medical degree.
Yeah.
All this stuff. And so then it cycled into this thing. And also it was horrifying. Like when you wake up in that moment of like, oh, you're not in control and that the life controls you. Yeah. It was kind of horrifying, to be honest. And so, it's basically Carlos Castaneda talks about this, which is called he talks about in terms of shamans that it's an experience when you meditate or whatever where the world stops and then you have this insight. Yeah. And so in that moment, then I went into a pretty deep depression. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. So finally my mom told me to come home. And when I came home, I started screaming, and I started screaming just because I was so horrified by like, I can't believe I'm not in control. Yeah. So remember when we talk about love and control? Yeah. So in that moment, so this Stop the World thing. So it was actually this other podcast I was listening to this morning with this other woman. Her name escapes me, but get it for you later. Put it in there because it was her.
Put it in the notes.
Yeah. So she she's a professor on the Huberman Broadcasts podcast who was talking about, she had this. And so she's the one who gave me the words. And then it was like Castaneda. And then she mentioned shaman. So I've always thought about that experience. So as shaman-like, and I'll talk about that more. But so then that's what it was. So I went through a depression, long story short. So I went home for a couple of weeks, and then how do they treat it? So this is where the shaman comes in. Yeah. Here's a pill. Yeah. No, but it had very little.
No talking,
and no one being like, what's horrifying you? I'm like, existence is horrifying me. No, I mean, so that's what they say. Yeah. So when they talk about Buddha, like one of the Buddha.
Is it like existential horror almost?
Well, it's waking up to, existential. It's the whole, like, it's, actually, in the Apocalypse Now at the end, he says the horror. So the horror is like, It's an easy way to say it. It's the specter of death.
Okay.
So the horror is waking up to being like, I'm not in control. That's the horror.
Yeah.
And the Iliad, what's Achilles' horror? He's born with an Achilles' heels, which means even though he's mostly God, he's going to die.
Yeah.
So it's the horror of, normally we just don't, it's called the denial of death. Normally we're just distracted with things because we don't see it. And really what death means is we're not in control.
Yeah.
For Achilles, he's not in control of his death.
That's a really interesting way of looking at death.
No, that's what it is. That's death.
You don't realize that, like for me, I don't really fear death for myself in a selfish way. I fear death in more the people that I will not see anymore.
Sure.
It's not really anything else, really. It's just like
people who will grieve you after you're gone.
Yeah, but it is a control aspect because you are no longer able to control if you can call a person or wake up next to your...
That's it.
Yeah, like...
So that's this... Yeah, you got it. So for me, it was that you out of control. And so that's it. And so it triggered the depression. And then eventually... But to be fair with the medicine does help, to get you through it.
Yeah.
I think that's the value of it.
Next week.
Yeah, it makes you get through to the sort of in the interim. So I'm not necessarily against it. Maybe perhaps more long term, it's maybe not the best choice, but it definitely was helpful. And then that's how. But eventually that horror turns into freedom.
Yeah.
So there's another thing this podcast talked about. So she talked about
it's like that Fight Club shit.
Yeah, tell me tell me.
Well, like in Fight Club, he basically they're making soap, I think, and there's a part because like Brad Pitt, Edward Norton, they're the same person. But like when you're watching the movie, you don't really realize it, or maybe ever, depending on how much you pay attention or not. But like basically, Brad Pitt burns Edward Norton's hand with this like acid they're making the soap with, and he like makes him keep it on there for like 10 to 15 seconds, even though it's scarring him and it's like the worst pain he's ever felt. And he's basically trying to get him to let go, to like lose control.
Wow.
And
dude,
it reminded me of that shit. Like,
yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's exactly it, actually. Yeah. So instead of that on the pain, it was this sort of mental anguish. And then, I'll let go. Oh, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think
you just taught me.
He's like holding the guy's hand. He's like,
thank you. Because, perfect. You just taught me something.
Yeah.
Well, no, because then it helps me with the rest of the story.
Yeah,
so then it leads into the rest of the story, which was then it freed me because I let go. Totally let go.
Yeah, that's how I read it.
Yeah. So for example, this is the best story to tell how I let go is, so it's sort of, Notre Dame is very mostly heteronormative. So my senior year, I did all these things. So I lived after that, I lived with a bunch of convicts for a year.
Word.
So two of my roommates were murderers. So because I had complete... nothing scared. And interesting after later. And they were all afraid of me. The convicts were.
Why isn't this guy worried about?
Exactly. They didn't mess with me. All the other students messed with me. And then eventually my senior year, there's this guy from a student, and I realized I needed to have a study partner.
Yeah.
So I asked the guy. So we go back to his room, and he takes his bag, and he goes, he had like a upside down pink triangle, and he goes, "Bill, do you know what this is?" And I go, "I don't know what this is." He goes, "I'm gay," and I'm like, I don't care. I'm not afraid of, and he's like, "Oh, yeah." I'm like, "Let's study." So we'd be in his room studying for hours.
Yeah.
And and then it turned out that was the one science class. Remember that I'm not a scientist. That was the one class I did get an A. Like all my other ones had like B's and stuff.
Yeah.
So then later, my sister ran in to someone from my class, and then they're trying to figure out who I was.
Yeah.
And then she's like, "Oh yeah." And then his senior year, he had a mohawk, and I'll tell you why I had a mohawk. But he goes, "Oh, the gay guy with the mohawk." So because, and I didn't even think that I was in there for hours studying. They thought I was studying anatomy, and I was studying physical chemistry with him, literally. So they and it's so funny, and I'm friends with him to this day. Every time, he's such a generous, nice person, and all that. Anyway, and So that's the mental health upside is, the scarring, right? So it let me let go. And so then that's how I then joined the PlayStation and Apple. That's how I got to Apple. Cause then I was just like, I'm not doing pre-med. I'm not a scientist, and then, so.
I kind of read that you were talking about like how you showed up to your interview. And there was definitely an aspect of some fearlessness there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you wanted it because you showed up for it.
Yeah.
But you also weren't so afraid that
You're
you're
gonna
willing
compromise
to say anything or do anything in order to get the job, which is like not you as a person.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that allowed you to, be involved with them. And
and I think that's so it freed you from societal norms. That's what it so because I woke, that's the freedom. It's like you're not afraid of anything because you can, eventually, thank you for that. You're very generous, like through your listening, you're very generous because you gave back something to me in terms of, that burning of this, because I've seen that movie. I actually met the author of the book. So that movie's based on, Stiff.
Child, right?
Well, it's Chuck, but then Chuck how you say Palahniuk or I forget how you say it, but he wrote the book, but he based it off of this other book, Susan Faludi, called Stiffed, which was all about all men being stiffed by the women's movement. And then that, so he sort of was inspired by that. So she showed up to one of the screenings of it. Wow. So I actually met her, and so I know a lot about it, but I didn't have interpretation. Yeah. So, in a lot of ways, you're like the new Janet Smith, because this is like a seminar.
He's giving me so much credit.
No, I'm 100%. Like, no, I'm 100%. Like, you're totally, as I say, bring in the action. Because I didn't have that interpretation, and the fact that you can rephrase it back to me in that way, it helps me to think about myself more. So it's truly a gift for me. So thank you.
Really weird sort of subject, and I don't really have a hold on it yet. So I apologize if there's a lot of like question marks or just kind of open-endedness to it. But one thing that I realized, I would say probably in the last 6 months, so it's kind of a fresh thing to me, but and it might be somewhat the fault of the gym, or it could be my own fault of just motivation to succeed and be better every year, whether it's a gym or whether it's a trainer. But that could be like on a business level, or just actually just being better at doing your job. I'm not really sure, but I think in moving to Chicago, my main goal was to be able to stay here initially. It was not moving back. That was like the first goal.
Back where again?
From the Quad Cities.
Quad Cities.
Yeah. And I kind of grew up in like more of a rural area. Not super rural, but it was definitely.
What was the name of the town?
Carbon Cliff.
Carbon Cliff. Okay.
It's about probably a 1,200 person town now.
But it's in Iowa or Illinois?
It's on the border of Illinois and Iowa.
But on the Iowa side?
Illinois side. Yeah.
Okay.
But so the initial goal was to not move out of Chicago, is to be able to like stay here and not move back. Because a lot of people, at least that I know, like they move back at some point, whether it's 1 year or 2 or 3 years.
Sure.
So accomplished that, eventually got into training, eventually started the gym. And then when the gym got going all the way up until about this year, I was so encompassed by just working more and saving money and trying to just get ahead and get the gym to the next step or whatever. But I think I actually lost a lot of who I was in that process. So really similar to your situation where you were doing sort of a job that wasn't exactly lined up for you. I was doing the right job, but I lost who I was.
Yeah.
And I did a podcast. We did a podcast with that Thai guy last Saturday, right? When I was talking to him, it just kind of came up randomly, and I had told him how I kind of like had a nickname when I was a younger guy.
Yeah,
right? My nickname was Scotty because my last name's Scott.
Gotcha.
And when I went into college, I didn't know anyone, so they just went off my ID, and I was Lawrence from then on. It wasn't on purpose. But the way I look at that was, I never really got back to who I was.
To Scotty.
Yeah, I never got back to,
Yeah, well, so for me, it was Angus.
Yeah, exactly. And so the reason that I needed to figure this out is that in the last 2 or 3 years, there was a lot of days that were going by that felt really fake. It didn't really feel like reality.
It's kind of empty.
Yeah, and it was weird because so my wife's named Katie, right? And she's this wonderful lady. She's amazing, right? I have all these amazing people around me.
Scotty and Katie.
Yeah, I have all these amazing people around me, like Justin and Shara,
Yeah.
and all these great clients, and I have really good friends too outside of the gym. But something still just kind of felt like it was missing a little bit, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And I think it was just through maybe maturity or age, I'm not sure what, but I really just started doing some thinking of what was missing. And I really just was like, you know what, let's just try to focus on being you and try to go back to what you were like as a kid or a teenager or whatever you were, whoever you were before you moved here, and had to focus on all these parameters of like performance and success. And I've been so much happier, and it's been so much more enjoyable to just be awake every day and just interacting with people, you know.
So yeah, that's in the.
That's what it reminded me of.
Well, that's Homer. That's Odyssey. So I talked about the Iliad, and then the role of the Iliad is to wake up to the fable being how to deal, and it's basically the fable is to sort of wake up, and then what you were going through then is the sort of the Odyssey, and so the Odyssey is basically the journey back home.
Yeah, it reminds me of like that Gladiator movie. It's like when he's all like messed up at the end of the movie, and he's just trying to get back home, and he's like,
but there's a difference. So you have to, this is the difference, right? So whereas before, if you would go home, you would be more on automatic response. And then but now you're more alienated from that. So if you go home now, you're coming back from a better place. So that's, so basically the Iliad and the Odyssey are twin fables. So you got to go through the Iliad first, and then you go to the Odyssey where you're brought home. And then you also bring up the other pieces, which is love. So you're totally the Odysseus in this case, because what you said there's all these things I love around here. There's Katie, your wife, Shara, Justin, your gym, the land of your gym, the territory. It's exactly the message that Homer had. But the trick is when you're in the Iliad, you identify with that. So when you were thinking about home before, you identified with that character that you were from home, and you're like, I don't want that anymore. So you're very you're emotional.
That's part of the reason I moved here.
No, that's what I'm saying. But you had to go through that. You got to go on this journey into the wilderness and run away from home, such that then you resolve it and accept it, and then you go back home.
There was even a guy when I moved here that I grew up with, and he gave me shit when I first moved here because I put Chicago as my like hometown or whatever. And he was like, "You're not from Chicago." He's like, "You're from Carbon Cliff or East Moline or whatever." And I was like,
and what did you feel though when he said that?
It pissed me off initially, but later I realized, I was like, man, he was so right.
So
it didn't give me shit, trying to make me realize.
Well, in both ways. So so actually it's from the Greek, from Homer. So I did a lot of research into the Greek terms. So he uses the word auto, like automatic, as identity is really what's going on. So, sing choir of the anger of Peleus, the son Achilles. So it's singing of that automatic anger response. So that's how most, you have to go through that process, and then you get to acceptance at the end. You have to essentially, what I call it, you have to kill the hectoring voice in your mind is what the goal of the Iliad. So the hectoring voice in your mind is what you would say in your head about that guy saying it. So you were able to mute it. So Hector is muted in your brain. So that means you've gone through the Iliad. Now Homer's like, okay, so once you go through that, what's next? You got to get back home.
Well, and it's funny because now it's a point of pride to me. So I'm like,
you totally get it.
And I'm like,
good for you.
I'm like this, like,
good for you, brother.
Sort of like small town. I wouldn't say country boy, like border.
Oh, beautiful. I'm so jealous. There's so many. That's what you then realize. So many people are jealous of them.
But like now, I also am like this city guy too, because I've spent so much time here, and it's this awesome blend. And I love. I don't know, like. Me and Shara, we did a podcast months and months ago, but we were talking about just sort of how we grew up, and like where we grew up. And I love kind of like messing up Shara's life with my experience, and same thing for her with and it's awesome, great. And but for some reason, I don't know, I guess when you're younger and you don't know any better, you just you try to avoid that stuff. You feel like you need to get away from it, and it's actually the whole reason we're here. You know, I feel like.
Yeah. So let me just tell you. So what's interesting is now I think Christopher Nolan, who did one of the movies he did.
I like Interstellar.
Interstellar. So he's doing a new movie on the Odyssey.
Which he is, isn't it?
But so the party might not.
Yeah.
I'm just curious if he'll get this element. But to me, this is the element. When they open up the Odyssey, they don't talk about the identity of who this book's about, because they're just talking about it as a generic man. They start, there's this man, and the reason is because when you start the Odyssey, you don't have that automatic identity anymore.
Yeah.
It's now the difference with you is you're choosing it versus where he was before.
Yeah.
And then when he gets home, he's invisible to his wife.
Oh, wow.
Literally invisible.
It's so different from.
And then he plays along with it, and then he just creates his identity in a moment. Back to Scotty.
Yeah.
Odysseus uses that same trope of creating a nickname. And when he's in the Cyclops, he's trapped in the cave with the Cyclops. He figures out how to blind the guy. So he takes a stick and he blinds him, but then he still has to get out because basically the Cyclops sits there and feels.
Yeah.
And so he grabs himself underneath the sheep. And so then he feels the sheep, but then he gets out and he figures he gets out. And then, but early on, before he got there, he told him his name was Nobody. So then what he says, the blinded Cyclops calls to the other Cyclops to stop him. Yeah. And he goes, and they're like, who escaped? And then he replies, nobody.
So he's thinking like, oh, well, we're good then.
Yeah. So, but the point is that, and then that's the eponym of Odysseus, is the shapeshifter. So now you have the ability, or he calls it polytropic. So you have many tropes or many turns.
Yeah.
So that's what you have and then, so you have this ability to then and do whatever.
Yeah.
But most importantly, you're guided by love.
Yeah.
You're guided by love of your land, which is this Chicago, as well as your homeland.
Yeah.
You're guided by love of your wife. You're guided by love of your family here. So that's you're living it. And so that's really gratifying for me because I'm a theorist, philosopher, because my position is that that's what he's talking about. And so when you tell me this is your lived experience, which just tracks exactly to the books, like you went through the Iliad, you had that strong auto-identification with emotional anger, with not wanting to go home.
Yeah.
Then you realize, okay, quiet the hectoring voice, kill the hectoring voice.
Yeah.
And then you come home.
Yeah.
And then when you come home, you're different.
Yeah. And before the podcast, we were just kind of, talking a little bit where we were getting set up, and we were talking about the podcast, and you're asking me like, what do you shoot for? What's the audience you try to target? And I kind of gave you like an I don't really know answer. I think that's kind of why, I like trying to, I mentioned that I didn't want to stop learning, and that's kind of why I wanted to do the podcast with Justin or other people that are outside just the weightlifting community.
Yeah.
And I think that's what a lot of my motivation is in trying to figure out that subject, is that a lot of people, not everyone, but as you get older, you sort of get stuck as who you are. Like whoever you are, when you're like 40 or 50, you might change a little bit. I want to try to change as much as possible. I want to have as many epiphanies as I had in 20, 30, and 40 as I get older. And that's kind of my motivation to keep doing it. Aside from it just feeling good to feel like yourself. You mentioned in your email that you wrote a book too, I think, or you mentioned something, Body Keeps the Score. Was that a book?
Oh, no, yeah. Well, we'll get into that. I didn't write a book. That's a book that was written, but we can talk about it. I want to circle real back, back to Chaperone, because I don't think I fully expressed that, especially since you're on the stage. So I told you the whole thing about the mental health, and this goes into Body Keeps the Score, so it's a good.
Okay, got it.
So what happened was so basically Homer stopped the world for me. Long story short, right? And then that woke me up.
Sure.
So the stopping the world is a lyric that Chaperone uses in Good Luck, Babe.
Yeah.
And then, so this morning I was listening to the lyrics, and when I realized what the lyric is, and I know a little bit background about her, is I think the lyrics coming, and this is my interpretation too, so it may be off from what she's saying.
Yeah.
But I think it was this internal dialogue that there's a normative thing that she should be heterosexual. And so it's this dialogue between Good Luck, Babe, and trying to be heteronormative because you're not. And so, and then the lyric is, you would have to stop the world for me not to be that, that internal voice. So she's kind of coming from it the other way, which was she's understanding that so for me, it was the world literally stopped for me, but she's singing about that same thing where in order for me not to be who I am,
Yeah.
the world would have to literally stop.
Yeah.
As opposed to having the experience of stop the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So kind of that's why I think what her lyrics in that song really resonate, because it's, again, using a more fable, for it, so anyone can relate to stopping the world.
Yeah.
In terms of like, this case for me, like the world, and then the other person who used, so anyway, so it's amazing to see the depth with her lyrics because of that. Yeah. Cause I know
there's a lot going on there.
Well, I know she had to come home and do some deep introspection and then get it out there. And I just loved that song, the melody and all that. Then it didn't really impact me till today from that podcast. And then the other person who uses Stop the World is someone who's been a teacher to me. I've been lucky enough to be taught by two of the greatest Buddhist masters. So one was who in this case was Thich Nhat Hanh, who was one of the greatest Vietnamese-born Buddhist masters. And so I went and did a retreat with him up in Canada, of all places. And long story short, one of his things is when you go to his retreats, he forces you to stop.
Okay.
And, so in other words, you go to lunch, you can't talk. He's forcing you to stop. And it's, maybe to help you see the hectoring voice in your head. Because we're always, and so his quote was, we have to stop the world because we're always running.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what you did, with your business. You're just running. Yeah. And so then you're like, no, stop. Hammer time. Yeah. So back to music. So I always use Stop Hammer Time from MC Hammer. I don't know if you know.
No.
So that's my little joke is Stop Hammer Time. Another one who does it is this guy Gurdjieff, which is another thing, but he talks about stopping too. When you walk in a door, stop.
Yeah.
Judaism, they do that you look over the mantle, there's always something they put ritualistically. So no matter where you go, to stop, because you're always so so that's why I think that's really what Chappell Rowan's really tying into. Yeah. That what makes a great musical artist is they have great onstage performers like yourself, Chappell Rowan does, and they tie into this deeper lyric of lyrics that are personal yet universal. Yeah, that's what I would get at. She's really speaking at a personal level. Yeah, this internal thing, it seems, interpretation. Sure. I could be wrong, but there's a personal level, but there's also this universal what stopping the world is. Yeah. And so, and that's what Thich Nhat Hanh was talking about. And then the other one, just real quick, and then we can get to Body Keeps the Score, was this great master, Sharmapa, who is the highest meditator from Tibetan Buddhism. So the Dalai Lama. Yep. Okay, so in the Dalai Lama school, it's Tibetan. There's basically 4 major schools, and then the 4 major schools have different color hats. Okay. So it's a little bit like a video game. Yeah. There's the red army, the yellow army, there's the white army, and then anyway. Okay. So my school, for whatever reason, is red and black. Okay. And so, so the highest is the Karmapa, and the second is the red hat. Anyway, long story short, the Sharmapa would come into town and do this meditation retreat, and he and then I finally realized, I'm like, oh my God, it's like the Michael Jordan of meditation, and he's coming into town. Yeah. And his meditation, anyway, it trains you how to make the world stop. So the thing with meditation is, meditation is just a practice to do what the Holy Prophet MC Hammer said, which is stop. The Holy Prophet. Yeah. As soon as I do it Western hours. Maybe. Well, I purposely do that to make you laugh, because it's, if I do this so deeply, then some of the students don't get it. So that's why I always practice routine. Yeah. It's kind of disruptive. But stop Hammer shop. But so I've just been lucky that he came into Chicago all the time, and I developed this relationship with him. And so he's the one who taught me to meditate, because I remember the first time I met him, I was like, oh, meditation, it gives you peace, it makes you clear your mind. And then he's like, you're wrong. He said that. Damn. And then I'm like, no, but it's this. I started arguing with him, and finally he said, go back to your other teacher. And that got my attention, because then I'm like, so then I kept coming back. Yeah. And then finally he gave me all these different types of teachings. So a lot of this, back to growth is, actually I met him, I think after a lot of my maybe at the same time, but after was a lot of my growth. Yeah, is through both Thich Nhat Hanh and then Sharmapa, in terms of so the Thich Nhat Hanh school is a little bit different from what I was. So my school is basically mystic school. Okay. So in Catholicism, it's the mystic school. So there's great mystics in Catholicism, like St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila. So the mystic tradition it's the mystic is more the ineffable performative trickster stuff.
Yeah.
That's the mystic tradition.
Yeah.
And the problem with the trickster tradition is it's not something that you can make a business out of.
Yeah.
So that's why the Catholic Church squashed it.
Well,
Because
it's pretty open-ended.
well, and the thing is, they haven't really squashed it. So let me explain, because so I went to St. John of the Cross, which is for grade school, and it turned out that I'm like, okay, so I'm attracted to this mystic tradition. I met the Sharmapam, connected.
Yeah.
I'm like, I bet St. John of the Cross was a mystic. I didn't even know. I looked it up, and sure enough, and I go,
Yeah.
I bet those. So the nuns ran it. These nuns.
Yeah.
I go, Sister Anastasia, great principal, love her.
Yeah.
I'm like, I bet you she is too. So sure enough, one of my classmates
Yeah.
told me that they had a mystic retreat up in Wisconsin that they would go to.
Yeah.
And so the mystic tradition, they would get there and dance and da da da.
Yeah, yeah.
So they were so the mystic tradition, I think, is still practiced in the
Yeah,
Catholic
yeah.
Church, but in terms of disseminating it,
Yeah.
it's not. You can't. Because the mystic tradition isn't something that you can talk about. It's the Fight Club.
I got it.
Right? You can't talk about that's the rules. You can't talk about the Fight Club.
It's the number one rule, yeah.
Yeah, what's the number? Tell me what it is.
Number one rule of Fight Club is you can't talk about Fight Club.
So that's the mystic tradition.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's the same thing.
Like it.
It's exactly the same. Now I think about it. So for whatever reason, and then actually in high school, I painted my ceiling red and black swirls. So the two leaders of my Tibetan school is the red hat and the black hat.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's all these. You get all these.
Yeah.
Like, wow, I like all of these things were around me. So long story, I woke up
Yeah.
to it. Now I'll answer your question. Body keeps the score.
Yeah.
So then I was like, why the heck are these teachers like Thich Nhat Hanh and Sharmapa responding to my other teacher, which I can't miss too, is Lama Ole.
Uh-huh.
That's a longer story, but he was sort of my gateway Lama into Sharmapa. So Lama Ole is like he's from Denmark, so Western, great, and he made it possible. And he would tell me like my energy channels are open, and I'm like, why the hell would what are energy channels, and why the hell would my energy channels be open? I don't even know what he's talking about.
Yeah.
So I'm like, okay, sure, these are people I trusted and respect. So finally one day I'm in an airplane. I remember I was flying to Seattle, and I was like, oh, my trauma. So in my life, I've had a fair bit of trauma.
Yeah.
Long story short, we don't have to get into it too much, but when I was a teenager, I got sort of quasi-kidnapped for like a week. And so that was my sort of trauma.
Yeah.
And then growing up was somewhat hard. So I had this, what they call complex post-traumatic stress from growing up. And then that was like the trauma event. That's what opened my channels. And in that moment, I'm like, oh, what a gift. My trauma.
Meaning that experience.
So there's a thing this Harvard professor talks about, and I can get you the name later, called post-traumatic growth.
Okay.
So normally we talk about is post-traumatic stress.
I like that term.
Yeah. So for me, that's what I experienced. I didn't know this Harvard guy came up with it, but I experienced it. So post-traumatic growth it opened my channels. Because what did it do? It created deep compassion. Because of what I went through is so painful and whatever.
Yeah.
So when I see it, I feel it, and I can work. You can work with it.
Yeah.
So in the book, The Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah.
The book is it's all about trauma and how trauma is in your body. So when you go through a traumatic event, it's in your body. So when these Tibetan guys are saying the energy channels in your body are open.
Yeah.
It's the trauma created these
your body is tallying, like
is what?
It's like tallying.
What is tallying?
Meaning like
tallying, like
like one.
Oh, he's in the score. Yeah. Tally. Yeah.
That's kind of how I was imagining it, like different experiences, good or bad.
There's always social media with Tally the clown at Disney where he's an elf and he comes up. You should watch the Tally. They're so fun. I watch it over and over again. Yeah. But he tallies whether you sinned or not.
Oh,
yeah. So for me, the tallying is the tallying is the trauma. But the trick was, however, I figured out, and this then feeds into you.
Yeah.
So this is where bodybuilding comes in.
Yeah.
So the way out of trauma and the way to make it post-traumatic growth. Mm-hmm. So this is where you could get clients.
Yeah.
Not to try to help you get clients, but with
never opposed to it.
It's okay. No, I'm serious.
No,
100%.
Yeah, exactly.
that's how I got the growth, was it's in the body. And before the book came out, the book came out more maybe last decade.
Okay.
I was starting this journey for myself in 2003 or so.
Yeah.
Long story short, so I started doing Pilates, and through doing Pilates, was the process that worked with my trauma in my body to get the not only the physical health but the mind health. So Joseph Pilates was view of fitness, that this is a heritage of fitness that would be interesting to talk with you about. But he was influenced by the Swedish lineage of viewing physical fitness is also as therapeutic and also spiritual, and not just to get a good body, not just not you. And so and I was kind of feeding on with your motivation to do it is like you didn't want to be hurt, and that, so this idea of like fitness being like not just to get the benefits of it independently, but to do the fitness. So he was influenced by all that, and so then that's what got me on the way of getting post-traumatic growth. So in the book, The Body Keeps the Score, that's what he talks about. With trauma, you can't heal yourself with just talking in the mind. You got to work with modalities with the body.
Yeah.
So then I got certified in Pilates. I then got certified in this fascia release methodology called meridian stretching.
Yeah.
So it's like you just do eccentric resistance.
Yeah.
And then that helps rip open the fascia. And then the fascia is in place because the fascia is there that gets formed at the traumatic event. So then what happens, the body's repeating that traumatic event because the fascia is frozen. But as soon as you release the fascia and open your body, you create the possibility of that energy that's the trauma to grow into something new.
I see what you're saying.
So I did meridian stretching, and then there's gyro. Gyro is more like using your body in a more rotational method. And then I did
almost like a dancing, sort of like
dancing, but normally, right? If you're doing your modes, they're linear.
Yeah.
But it's more like spiral, like
fluid. Yeah.
Yeah. So like dancers, when they do their arms, they're doing the spiral motion. So it's like I suppose with your ropes, you would learn how to do it for spiral. So it's more focusing on how to not just do linear motions, but spiral and moving your things.
Yeah.
So from all of that, anyway. And then I did salsa dancing. So I became it took 2 years of intense. I got to sort of maybe a master level of salsa dancing. And then that helped me. I did that because I had the other aspect. Trauma is also a bit on the autism spectrum. So I didn't know how to socialize with women.
Gotcha.
So what I did was I'm like,
take a help of that. That's for damn sure.
Well, right. And so when I went to Latin street dancing here in Chicago, the best therapy, because there's a circle and there's a circle of girls.
Yeah.
So you dance for a minute, then you got to go to the next girl.
Yeah.
And basically what it did is it trained out all the anxiety because it's like, oh, I have to talk to the next girl because being a bit on the autism spectrum. And all of a sudden there's rules for touching the woman too. So then, I can touch a woman.
Yeah.
Oh, if I touch her hip, that's okay. It was crazy therapeutic.
Yeah.
So I learned to do that.
Yeah.
And then I did acting, and then I became a professional juggler. So I was the Chicago Sky summer juggler for 2 years.
Wow.
So I would I would dress as a referee and juggle basketballs. That was my shtick.
Yeah.
So but behind the scenes, all of that was driven by trauma and my goal to heal. To work with it. So now I work with the trauma as my trauma is my greatest gift.
Yeah. Because
through it helps me. Like my acting. I did a scene with the DePaul graduate acting instructor. I took, so I did this thing called Meisner, where you basically repeat what the other person says. And I did a scene with the graduate theater. Yeah. And I did the scene, and then afterwards she's like, is that like a professional actor? Yeah. And the reason why is because I learned to tap into my trauma. Because now I'm like, because every day my trauma fills me up. Yeah. But now when it fills me up, it's not anger. I transform it. So this is what's called Tantra. Here's the anger, but I transform it into so today I show up, I did your bench press a few times. so I work, I did some curls. Yeah. So I work with the energy that's trapped in my body from the trauma. Yeah. And I transform it through the body. So I have two questions for you. One is that, so you've done all these things, through trauma, essentially. Yes.
which it's a big list, right? And it's great because, it seems like you'll do one thing and you move on to the next thing.
Correct.
Relax, but is this something do you think you focus on the trauma on a regular basis, or do you think you focus on these specific things that you're into, and that's like you dealing with it? Like, is it like an autopilot kind of thing where it's just doing its own thing now and it's serving all these purposes?
Oh, okay.
Or
So
do
this
you
is
think about it?
Yeah. So okay. Great question. So this gets into your value hierarchy thing. So I take a Buddhist view.
Mm-hmm.
So the Buddhist view, and this is what the Sharamapa taught me.
Yeah.
Is we don't view the human identity as subject object. It's all three at the same time.
Okay.
So at this, right. So when you have a value, the problem with the value hierarchy, and you're saying about making it spread, you may not want to do that, because when you try to have something you value to spread, that reifies subject object. Because now you're asking the other person to be subject to that value.
Okay.
So it's a tricky. So what you want instead is when I do the activity, I am the activity. I'm not the subject that had that trauma.
Yeah, that's how I read it. But I wasn't sure because you don't really know.
Yeah, but certainly I verify into the subject. So so things will come up at times about it, or
yeah, sure, yeah.
But it's not. It's at this point. Lama Ole, Lama Ole. He has these really good. It's like, before the trauma, the thoughts of it would be 60% solution, so 60% acidic maybe. Mm-hmm. Now it's maybe 5%. Like and it's also Buddhists would say, it's like, the pain's still there, but it's not much. And the other thing, this is the lesson of the Buddha though. The Buddha, the fundamental ontology is suffering.
Makes sense.
Everything's suffering. So the trick is with the trauma, it's like, that's why it's the greatest gift, because now it's just another list of the pains that I had or go through. Yeah. And so I was talking with my teacher, Rachel, who's part of this Sharmapa's group, which is called Bodhi Path. So Bodhi Path is the Sharmapa's group. Yeah. And then Rachel's the American teacher who's done like 7 years of training. She's amazing. Mm-hmm. So I was talking to her this week, and there's the term that I essentially was coining to make sense of what he's meant by suffering. Mm-hmm. What he means by life is suffering is you have to learn to suffer correctly. Mm-hmm. So what he means by that is all of life is suffering, but there's better suffering than other suffering. And if you learn to suffer correctly, the ground of life is joyful and fun. Yeah. The problem is when you don't suffer correctly, when you run away from my trauma, now I'm still suffering, but I'm suffering in a way that disconnects me from being in the joy. Yeah. So the correct way to suffer is to work with it. Yeah. And why? Because it's still there at some level. Yeah. But it's not, I'm correctly suffering by working with it.
I have two close friends who are veterans, and I don't know if this is a military term or if this is just the thing they say. I'm not really sure. But I've seen they've written it on the ground out there in chalk next to their squat rack, or if
they work here. They work here.
Yeah, they work out here.
And what did they write?
Suffer to honor.
Suffer what?
Suffer to honor. And
absolutely, So that's it. That's absolutely the same thing. Yeah, that's yeah.
You can suffer and let it eat you. And consume you.
That's it. They got it. Yeah. So as I said earlier, with you figuring out Iliad Odyssey, I just give you a framework. Yeah. And it's also validating to me because there you go. Yeah. They're suffering correctly.
Yeah. And it's funny because people can kind of view those guys as like, being meatheads and ignorant and, whatever. And a lot of times they're just in here working out with their shirts off right when they get here. It could be in January, but of course, there's a lot more going on in there than you realize.
They have to. And that's the body keeps the score. Oh, so that's the message of it. They have to, but that's also the gift. Yeah. Because then when you said to me early on, like, it must be hard to get up at 5 a.m. to work out. Not hard at all.
Yeah. Well,
because my motivation,
able to, it's not like
able, but also the motivation of knowing my like once like it's almost like it's the gift that motivates you. Yeah, because it's like I got to do it because if I don't, I'm not going to suffer correctly. Yeah, and that's why.
Or a week will be like that if you're not.
Yeah, and then that
is exactly right.
It's when it's back to Iliad, when you accept who you are. It's that radical acceptance. Yeah, I'm accepting. It's just like the Achilles. He's just happened to be the heel. Me, it just happens to be like I went through this thing, and my mom and this kind of thing, difficulty, but I love my mom. It's all good.
Yeah.
It's just, they're human. It's nothing, even the person I had that sort of kidnapped, it's like, doesn't even know what he's doing.
Yeah.
This is totally the Buddhist view, right?
Yeah.
So it's just this gift that, so getting up, it's like, some days it's like, hard to get up, but then other days it's just like, this is my gift.
Yeah.
So when you realize that suffering is honor, that's it. Anyway, so it's gratifying for me. So partly coming here is, as a philosopher, sometimes you're like, I guess it's all bullshit. But then when I tell this framework and then you say like, they're living it and real, like for them, like I would probably say my trauma relative to them, well, it's just different, right? So everyone's, if we go to Christianity, right, everyone's cross is different, right?
Sure.
So it's there you go.
And the last question I have for you, and there's so many things that we didn't get to, so we'll probably have to do this again sometime.
That'd be fun. Yeah.
But the one thing that that stood out to me is that you mentioned your involvement with application of physical therapy platforms or publishing platforms.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And I wanted to ask you just really quickly about that. And the reason I wanted to ask is we were talking earlier about, programming for clients. We have a physical therapist in the gym, which is huge. It's a huge honor to the gym because it's very difficult to get a physical therapist in the gym as a small niche boutique gym. A lot of but in my opinion, you have to be taken seriously enough by a physical therapist to have them want to be in your gym in the first place. And then B, you have to maintain that relationship by having people that are interested in getting better in all ways, instead of just aesthetically or just strength wise. It's people that like Justin wants to live forever. Right. That was like something we talked about, but there's a lot of people that they want to do that in their own way. They want to be healthy for their family. They want to be healthy for their career long term. They just don't want to feel like shit as they age.
Grandparents wanting to pick up grandkids.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's a major reason that we have Becca, that's her name, in our gym as a physical therapist. But when you mentioned that, I started thinking about like the program that she uses to run her business off of, and not just the scheduling program, but her choices of exercises that she prescribes to her clients, and then we of course use like Mind Body, which is our scheduling program for the gym. But I was just wondering like what your involvement is with physical therapy or sort of publishing platforms, because I was like, man, maybe he's working on something that we utilize, or maybe he's working on something that we will utilize at some point, or thinking about something.
Well, it's amazing synchronicity. So coming full circle to maybe doing business with you, because so I work with so part of the entrepreneurship, I still do entrepreneurship, and I obviously now why cognitively, because I'm always needed something new. So the new I've been, and then I did do a startup for 2.5 years called Stigma app, which was like a TikTok like app to connect people with similar mental health issues, and we won the 2022 App for Good.
Wow.
And then, but eventually, thank you. Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah. And it's all motivated, by not even trying, it's because when you don't try,
that's when you get
rewarded. No, it's right.
It's totally.
You're right.
We got an Amazon incubator, we got funded. But anyway, the business long-term didn't work out for various reasons, which don't have time to go into. But through that, then I met other female ones. So I'm involved with really 2 of them. But the one that's germane to you is a company called Smart Charts. And so what they're trying, Corinne is the CEO. So I work with her on using, to trying to do 2 things for physical therapy, is to visualize it so that the customer or patient can get a visualization of what projected future will look like. So increasing, so that's one thing. So that's in the immediate term. So we have a National Science Foundation grant.
Wow.
For doing that. Now, of course, it's on pause because of the government things going on right now. So
dot.
Yeah. And then, but we're still working on it, and I'm still thinking. Sure. So that could be one connection, because we're looking for people then to actually, do customer interviews if they would want to. So basically, I'm trying to innovate on that end.
Yeah.
So one is visualization, but the next phase is then, this idea of gamification, or the term I use, which is gamiforming. So using game mechanics to transform the client. So using so not only visuals, that's sort of the short-term goal with the grant, but then using using it to also maybe do simulations to say like, here's where you are now. If you do this, this is your predicted
I like it.
result.
Yeah.
And then that's to help to feed the motivation for the client to come back and give them more
visual learners too.
There you go.
I mean, not everyone's like that, but there's a good chunk of people who are. And
so that's the work. So it's all at the cutting edge of future things. So we don't. So she has something she's using now. Corinne does. There's a lot more we could talk about. I'd love to meet Becca then, because
I would introduce.
There'd be lots of conversations.
Yeah, I think she would be very, very interested in talking to you about a lot of things, but especially that. And one of the biggest things that she harps on a lot of her social media posts, but also just in her like philosophy in life, because I see her every Thursday, whether I feel good, bad, or the other, no matter what. Right.
Oh, for your own personal physical therapy.
I had for a long time, even before she worked here.
Gotcha.
That's kind of how she ended up working here to a degree.
Yeah.
Not just because of me, but a lot of people in the gym were seeing her elsewhere. And we were both just like, well, why don't you just do it here?
Yeah.
Instead of all of us driving, in a different neighborhood or so. But her philosophy that I've spent many hours talking to her about while she's working on me is that not viewing injury as necessary, not like a negative thing, but having like a positive outlook on it and seeing what you can do still, seeing like, not focusing so much on, I hurt this thing and it's hurting and I can't do anything and I'm screwed and, like I'm in this hole and I got to dig myself out. It's very opposite philosophy.
Into the suffering.
Yeah. And you work
suffer correctly.
Suffer correctly.
Yeah, you work with her too.
Yeah.
And there's very little talk of that, and you are discussing the injury or the problem or the problem you want to avoid, but it's more about the planning for the future.
Yeah.
And I think just the visualization aspect of
that's good to hear.
See, I think there's a lot of sort of like on the ground things that are happening that would fit really well with
awesome
sort of the thing that you're planning to put together.
I'd love to talk.
Maybe we haven't looked at it like on a screen or on our phone or in a way that we could understand it. Like
so that's our sort of goal, is to come up with those visuals, and then the next part is then making it the game element too, so like interactive goals to it. So that's my I have so normally people talk about gamification, which is more like you have a scoreboard out there. That's gamification, right? You put the numbers. So you do gamification. So gamiforming is a little bit more about customizing it to where the goal. It's similar to gamification, but it's a little bit more about transforming the person, as opposed to like being more competitive. So it's a bit more.
That's kind of what that is, actually. That list out there. It's everyone's best squat, bench, and deadlift.
It's amazing
with certain parameters, right? You can't just use like any random bar. And you can't have any help from anyone. But
there's rules to the game.
Exactly.
Perfect.
But there's people that have their name up there that are 70 years old. And they might have 2.5 pounds on each side of the bar. There's people on that board that their 3 lifts are above 2,000 pounds total.
Wow.
It's unbelievable. It's extremely elite. There's people in the middle like myself. It's across the board, but
to me that's what would be gamiforming, right? Because gamification then would be more like you're trying to win, or
there's like 10 slots and
gamiforming is the goal. So gamification would be like here's a competition, there's one winner. Gamiforming is more like no, the game is against yourself.
That's
it.
We respect everyone equally. If you're willing to walk in the door and participate and take it seriously for yourself.
It's amazing.
That's enough for us.
That's great.
And it's crazy the results that you'll get from that. It's kind of like you were talking earlier, like I wasn't really trying, or we weren't really trying.
That's right.
So we're working really hard, but we're really not trying in the sense of being like, God, I got to beat that guy. I got to be the best in the gym. It works better that way, I think. But no, this is great. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. I know that, you don't live nearby all the time, and I'm sure you have a very busy schedule. But it was great, and just thanks for everything that you do, and thanks for mentoring Justin. Justin's probably whether he realizes it or not, one of the biggest influences in my life as far as critical thinking and trying to find a better way to do things. And we talk about a lot of things when we train together, that's just very random and haphazard. It seems like, hey, what's going on?
Yeah.
But to me, it's a lot more than that.
Well, and that's a real honor to your space of listening. So thanks for listening to me. It's really meaningful to me. So, in the fact that you could follow my conative style of jumping all over the place. So hopefully there's enough clarity throughout the talk.
No,
people
it's
can follow.
fantastic. Yeah. All right, Shar. I think that'll do it for us.